We'll be back in the Sheffield Crucible at 1 for more World Snooker after Hugh Edwards and Vote 2013.
Very good afternoon. It's election day +1 and welcome to the BBC's Election Centre, where we are monitoring the results of 35 council contests, a parliamentary by-election, 2 mayoral battles, voting yesterday, lots of the results today. It's the biggest electoral test of the year, easily, and there are high stakes for all the parties, all of their leaders, with just 2 years to go before the general election. Let's talk about Nigel Farage, because he is celebrating this morning. Here he was at Westminster just a few hours ago. He says it's been a remarkable night for his party as UKIP's performance exceeded all predictions. He's already gained more than 40 councillors, including 16 in Lincolnshire. And he says it marks a real sea change in British politics. We shall see. So far for David Cameron, well, there's been a loss of dozens of council seats for the Conservatives. Councils in Lincolnshire and Gloucestershire have passed from Conservative to no overall control. Both Labour and UKIP have made some gains in these areas. They've held 5 traditional Tory strongholds, though. There has been some good news for the Tories, including Essex and Dorset. What about Labour? Well, they held on to the parliamentary seat of South Shields. That was a parliamentary by-election caused by the resignation of David Miliband. It's been Labour since the 1930s, very safe seat. But the majority was reduced by nearly 5,000 votes, though they did maintain their share of the vote. It's important to say that. Not a great night for the Lib Dems in South Shields. They finished 7th, lost their deposit. So that wasn't the best of outcomes for them, but they made some gains elsewhere in the local authorities. Now, as I was saying, we've had a few results in. In fact, 8 local authorities have declared, but 27 to go. Those who've declared stayed up late overnight, worked hard, and got the results in. There's lots of counting going on this morning and into this afternoon. Let's have a look at our first image, because we're in Norfolk here, and we were talking to one of our correspondents in Norfolk earlier. They were talking there about the surge that the Greens have experienced in some areas of Norfolk and the east of England, talking too about the Labour challenge. But of course, it's been a very strong Conservative area for them for many years. So the latest from Norfolk coming up quite soon for you. And then we'll also be in Northumberland. Again, some of the declarations being made, but we'll be looking at the outcome in Northumberland, where certainly between, let's say between 1 and 2 o'clock, I think we may get something from Northumberland, which is a little more final, but last contested in 2008, and there's been a lot of boundary changes there, so it's been difficult to make a comparison. However, we'll see what they've done in Northumberland in just a while. And then why don't we also have a look at the one local authority outside England, counting today, Angle C. Special circumstances here, where the local authority was put into special measures by the Welsh Government because of, well, a decade or more of political infighting and a bit of deadlock, I suppose, but a bit of a scandal in terms of Angle C's local government track record. So that election was meant to have happened last year. It's happening this year. That is the one Welsh local authority that is being contested. Lots to come, so stay with us. First, an update on the news with Carrie.
Thanks, Hugh. The Conservatives say people who vote for the UK Independence Party, which is enjoying unprecedented local election success, must be listened to. UKIP's taken more than 40 seats in the councils declared so far and pushed the Conservatives into 3rd place in the South Shields parliamentary by-election. UKIP's leader, Nigel Farage, is claiming a sea change in British politics. Around 24 councils have yet to return full results. Our political correspondent Chris Mason reports.
They don't have any MPs, they don't run any councils, but this is a big moment for UKIP. So far, they've won around 1 in every 4 votes cast, making them impossible to ignore.
Go, Nigel, go!
And so the champagne's flowed for the party once described by the Prime Minister as loonies, fruitcakes and closet racists.
We've been abused by everybody, the entire establishment, and now they're shocked and stunned that we're getting over 25% of the vote everywhere we stand across the country. This is a real sea change in British politics.
12,000.
Labour did hold the one parliamentary seat up for election, a seat they've held for generations, South Shields. Labour won here too on North Tyneside, where its candidate for mayor beat the Conservatives. But both these victories were must-wins. Overall, the party's performance has been mixed.
Some people who haven't voted before have come out and voted UKIP. But I think it is a party of protest, and I don't think it's a party of government.
The Conservatives lost control of Lincolnshire and Gloucestershire because of UKIP's gains, posing questions for the Tory leadership.
We hear you, we get what you're saying, we understand people want to see change, they're impatient for it, and I certainly want to kind of make the point straight off the bat that, you know, we appreciate that people are anxious to see problems fixed in this country and things move on.
Liberal Democrats insist they're encouraged by how they've performed in areas where they have MPs. But in the South Shields by-election, they finished 7th, only narrowly beating the monster-raving Looney Party.
All over the country, people have been arguing for Liberal Democrat policies against the Tories, by and large, in the counties of England. And in many cases, like in Gloucestershire, where we have gained seats, I'm not complacent at all.
These elections will be remembered for UKIP's breakthrough, as small as the party still remains. But there are still plenty of results to come. The tussle between Labour and the Conservatives in counties like Lancashire and Staffordshire, just as important, engaging the relative appeal of the two biggest parties at Westminster. Chris Mason, BBC News.
In other news, the jury in the trial of Mark Bridger, accused of murdering 5-year-old April Jones, has been shown CCTV footage of his movements around the time she disappeared. Mr Bridger is shown buying alcohol in a Spar store, and his Land Rover is seen outside his home and being driven locally. He denies murdering April last October. The Royal Bank of Scotland returned to profit in the first quarter of the year. The bank, which is more than 80% owned by the taxpayer, made a pre-tax profit of £826 million, compared to a £1.5 billion loss in the same period last year. The RBS chairman, Sir Philip Hampton, says the bank should be ready for a return to the private sector by the middle of next year. A security man who worked for the former News International chief executive Rebecca Brooks is being charged with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. David Johnson is accused of concealing a computer and other items and will appear before Westminster magistrates next Wednesday. The charge comes as Scotland Yard continues its investigations into phone hacking and payments to public officials. Those are the headlines. Now let's return to the team at Westminster for all the latest on the local election results.
Carrie, many thanks. Yes, welcome back to the BBC's election studio, where we are expecting now quite a flood of results to come in the next couple of hours. We're about a quarter of the way through, 8 councils declared, 27 to go. And time really for me to introduce the panel to you that we have today. Grant Shapps, the Conservative Party Chairman, Sadiq Khan for Labour, and the Business Secretary of the Lib Dems, Vincent Cable, is here as well. We'll be with you in a second, gentlemen. Nick Robinson is back with me. And Nick, really, it's time for us to, at this stage, just take stock. Where are we?
We've sent in for the clowns, haven't we? That's what's happened. The man who was referred to, the party referred to by Ken Clarke as the clowns, UKIP, they're the ones laughing today. It's absolutely clear, not just in that by-election where, yes, they came second, but got around a quarter of the vote, and right across England, and it is England, let's remember, they are getting about a quarter of the vote in many places. This is their day. Now, important note, it's not their day in the sense of they're now running large parts of England. They're not. They won't run any council at the end of this. They're not even winning huge numbers of council seats. Many, many more than they had before, but still way off the sorts of totals the Liberal Democrats, Labour and the Conservatives have won. But they are dictating the political weather. In party headquarters, throughout Westminster, what they are doing is thinking, what do we say about Nigel Farage? What do we do about Nigel Farage? And they're trying to comfort themselves. So the Conservatives are saying to themselves, this isn't great, but maybe it's not good enough for Ed Miliband to get to number 10. Ed Miliband's people are saying, well, it's not absolutely great, but it's certainly bad for the Conservatives making some progress. And the Liberal Democrats saying, at least we're hanging on in those places we've got seats. The honest answer to, are any of them right, is they don't know and we don't know. We don't know whether this is a one-off, massive protest vote to UKIP or the beginning of a new political force putting down roots in local communities throughout England, which will then go on and win. The fact we don't know, of course, makes it a whole lot more interesting.
Indeed, it does. The tone, I think, Nick, really, for the coverage so far was set by South Shields with the parliamentary by-election, a very different contest to the local council elections. Maybe worth actually having just a look at the figures, because they were really quite startling in some ways. We can see the UKIP there surged into second place on nearly 6,000 votes, and a majority of 6,500 there to Labour. Very safe Labour seat, and although their majority dropped, they maintained their share of the vote is around 50%. If we have a look at the share, there you see it, 51%. I think David Miliband's share was maybe a couple of points above that. UKIP on 24%. From a standing start, they weren't even in this contest in South Shields in 2010. Conservatives on 12, Independents on 5, others on 8. And before Vince Cable has a go at me, the Lib Dems did so badly here that they're actually in with the others. I think it was 1.4%, Vince, actually, in South Shields, though you're not claiming to have a strong base there, so that's fair enough to point out as well. Are people right to say, when Nigel Farage saw that, he said, that's the proof. We're not just talking here about local issues. We're not just talking here about local councils. That result in South Shields is the result that tells you we will be game changers in 2015.
Well, I don't think it does prove that. It certainly does prove what the UKIP are saying, is that this is no longer a few disgruntled Tory councillors swapping to another party, UKIP, and so that you look in traditional areas of the Tory South. Clearly, UKIP can mass huge numbers of votes with almost no organisation, even in Labour strongholds, even in the north of England. It tells you that. It tells you, yes, that this is a national reaction, but what it seems to me to say is that there is a large portion of the British electorate, about a quarter it would see, certainly in England, who are looking around wherever they are for the person who will kick the establishment hardest. And they happen to have alighted, at the moment, on Nigel Farage. Curious. Public school boy, son of a stockbroker, from Kent, member of the East India Club, not a natural anti-establishment figure in many ways, but he has become that figure. We've seen that sort of figure throughout Western Europe since the terrible banking crisis of 2008, and it is a question, that's what we have to say, it is a question, we don't know the answer today, whether he can now dig down and make himself an electoral force in Westminster elections. He certainly can in Europe in a year's time. We know UKIP have already done that. But can he do it in Westminster? And if he does, how do these established parties react? One last thought, Hugh. How they react will shape the future of this coalition government. Because if, as we've seen in recent weeks, the Conservative Party say, let's emphasise core messages, immigration, tougher prison regime, etc., you will increasingly see the Liberal Democrat coalition allies say, hold on, this isn't quite the Tory party that we signed up to govern with in 2010. It will force them somewhat apart.
OK, we'll ask the panel for their views on that in just a second. It will help us, though, before then, to just remind ourselves where we are. Emily?
This scoreboard could change a lot in the next couple of hours, but let me take you through the results that we've had in so far. The vast majority of these councils are in traditional Tory heartlands, so don't be surprised to see the majority at the top are Conservative, 247, but they have lost 75 so far today. The Lib Dems in second place. They're often in second place on the actual councils themselves. On 89, they're down 16. Labour on 57, they've made gains of 42. Interestingly enough, the same number that UKIP made from a standing start, they're on 42, making the same gains. The Green Party, not a lot of movement. They've just gained one seat here. And I'll show you what that means in terms of the councils themselves, because this is where it starts to get a little bit more interesting. The Conservatives are on 5, but they have lost 2. So not to Labour, not to the Lib Dems, but 2 have moved into no overall control. And when we start to break these up, you'll see why I say it's more interesting. Lincolnshire, a very, very Tory part of the world, although you could say quite a Eurosceptic part too. If I show you what has happened here today, the Conservatives have lost overall control. They remain the largest party, but look at this insurgence of UKIP. 16 councillors here now, Labour on 12, Independents still got a fairly substantial presence, the Lib Dems on 3. And if I show you overnight what happened, there you get the picture. The gains then by UKIP and Labour. Labour lost 15 councillors here last time round. They haven't made them all back. We don't know whether the UKIP vote has actually cut into the Labour vote as well as the Conservative vote at this stage. But what we do know is that the Conservatives were not expecting to lose Lincolnshire. Let me show you one other one, Gloucestershire, which was a little bit less safe in Conservative terms. But this is the result now. The Conservatives losing control on 23, the Lib Dems on 14, Labour on 9, UKIP on 3. Let's just show you overnight. Gains here for the Lib Dems, gains here for Labour, and gains for the first time in Gloucestershire for UKIP, the Conservatives taking the big hit here. But I want to show you one other comparison which tells us a very interesting story tonight. And I've put these 3 up because you can see in each place, when we do it as a share of the vote throughout the council, UKIP is coming in second place. Away behind the Conservatives, certainly in Dorset, but second place here, second place in Hampshire on 25%, second place in Essex. And this is where it gets quite interesting to have a look. UKIP, Labour and the Lib Dems all on 9 seats here. That is quite a dramatic result for what now looks to be equally second here. Hampshire, if we go into it, remember Eastleigh, UKIP coming second to the Lib Dems here. But many of these seats here, many of the 10, are in that Eastleigh constituency, 3 of them at least. So they have started to make gains that we saw in the by-election. And one more, which is quite interesting. Remember, they're on 22% of the share here. But because we have a first-past-the-post system, it doesn't equal out when you look at the number of seats. UKIP on just 1 seat because their vote is spread right across, but 22% of the share, putting them nominally in second place.
Emily, thanks very much. Important developments in Derbyshire, certainly, and that is such a key battleground. So I'm going to go there next and talk to Matthew Mroliwala, who will give us the latest there. Matthew?
Hugh, Labour have just taken Darbishire, 64 councillors. The magic number was 33. They have just hit that in the last few minutes. The Conservatives taking Darbishire in 2009. Well, Labour have just taken it back. With me is the Transport Secretary, local MP Patrick McLaughlin. Thanks very much for being with me on a difficult night for the Conservatives.
Well, yes, it's a difficult day. We won this county council 4 years ago. We hadn't controlled it for 28 years before that. This was Labour's #1 target. So, you know, it's not really a great surprise.
Has the political landscape changed? Strong showings here too for UKIP. No seats won, but strong showing. Has the landscape changed, and is that a danger for the Tories going into 2015?
Well, look, like any elections, you look at what's happened with the results and you take note of those results. We're in very difficult economic circumstances. It's not surprising people are frustrated and they want to see results. That's something that's not lost on me as a member of the government, and it's not lost on the rest of the government either.
Grant Shapps was saying earlier in the day that you've got the message, and then went on very quickly to say what we need to do is accelerate the strategy. Is that getting the message, or rather ignoring the message, do you think?
No, I think it is getting the message. It is showing people what we're doing as far as welfare is concerned, as far as the economy is concerned, as far as cutting immigration is concerned.
You haven't even taken time to actually look at what the voters have said and actually digest it before saying you know what they're saying.
Well, we've been listening to the voters over this campaign, and so we
why didn't you adjust your strategy? You've lost.
Because you can't do it overnight. We've got to absorb the message that we've got from these elections, and we'll take note of those elections. But we are addressing some very difficult issues. You know, nobody likes reforming the welfare system. It is essential we do it.
And how do you go forward? Because in a sense, you have 3 ways to look now. Do you shift to the right? How do you take on Labour, where you've lost to here? Keep the Liberal Democrat vote?
We lost 1 seat here to the Labour Party. What we do is we show we're listening, we carry on as we are as far as reforming the welfare system is concerned.
So no change?
No, of course we listen, and of course we'll take note of what's being done, but it is also seeing that change come into operation. A lot of the changes that we're being asked of have actually been bits of legislation that we've been pursuing over the past 2 years and are now coming to fruition.
Patrick McLaughlin, thanks very much for your time. Hugh, back to you.
Matthew, thanks very much. Matthew Mroliwala with that news from Darbishire, which is that, although the full figures aren't in yet, but Matthew telling us that his information there in the county is that Labour have actually taken control of Darbishire, which Sadiq Khan will be, well, you're already smiling.
It's great news. I didn't expect us to bounce back in one term in any of these seats. It bodes well for a general election. The point is this: we lost badly 4 years ago. As I've said, you need to have members. Those members need to become active. They need to be willing to stand for council. You then need to canvass and persuade neighbours to vote for you. You become a councillor. That's your toehold. You then go on to become active and win a parliamentary seat. We lost extremely badly in 2009. We got hammered. We got hammered again in 2010, losing thousands of members in 2009, 2010. And to bounce back these all-out elections in one term is fantastic. I congratulate all the councillors, the activists, the members, the supporters and the voters for having the trust in just 3 years to vote Labour again when they deserted us in droves in 2009 and 2010. And I'm very, very pleased.
Go on, chaps, your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just a fact check, actually. I think it was an overall control council.
They lost in 05, didn't they?
Right
it was a hung council, absolutely right, yes.
It's because there was a defection from the Tories to UKIP, and therefore we treat it like it was going into the elections, which is effectively...
Most recently it came from no overall control. And, you know, look, this was the seat that the county that all experts agreed Labour would definitely win. I don't think there's any doubt. I mean, in fact, no, I'm trying to tackle this. No, I mean, if you speak to all the...
This is why you've got the nickname Comical Alley. Look, come on, give credit where it's due. We won the election. It was a good bounce back after one term.
I mean...
let me just respond to that. From overall control, I'm simply trying to make the point. I'm not trying to make it hugely political. I'm just simply saying that John Curtis, the BBC election expert, said this was one of the counties that Labour's absolutely certain to win. That's a fact. And, you know, congratulations, you've won it. But that doesn't make, I think, the kind of progress that Ed Miliband will have been wanting to make if he was on the road to number 10. And that's going to be the fundamental question of today. And I don't know the answer yet, but this is not a surprising result.
Vince Cable, how do you see things?
Overall?
Yes.
Well, I think from our point of view, there were two stories. I mean, one was the by-election. It was absolutely dreadful. But we'd similarly had an awful result in Rotherham, then a few weeks later won the by-election at Eastleigh, and that's the story of by-elections when you're in government. And similarly in local government, I mean, Sadiq's recent history of Derbyshire is in many ways a pen picture of what happens everywhere, that if you have an incumbent government, you tend to get hammered locally, which is unfortunate because a lot of guys are doing great work in local councils. They're not rewarded for it, but then in opposition you tend to recover. And I think probably they're a bit disappointed overall, but nonetheless that's the story, and we're in government, and we would have in the past soaked up some of those opposition protest votes. We're not, because we're in government. But where we've been head-to-head with the Tories in parliamentary seats, which we hold, for example, we've gained ground to some extent. Places like Cheltenham, Eastbourne, Mid-Dorset. And so, you know, given that we will, the next general election, be holding our parliamentary seats, there's a lot of encouragement from that.
Are you surprised in any way by the views of some of our experts earlier, saying that, yes, of course, people expect UKIP to be taking most of their votes from former Conservative supporters, but actually Labour and the Lib Dems are also affected by the surge in UKIP support?
Yeah, they have taken support from us and Labour, but most of all from the Conservatives. And I think we've got to take the UKIP phenomenon seriously. I thought Nick Robertson's analysis was spot on. We don't know where they're heading, whether this is temporary or permanent, and we've got to, you know, think carefully about how we deal with it. I think it's a mixture of things. I mean, there's a general protest, but it's added to the fact that we're in a major economic crisis. Rather, it's a bit like the phenomenon you've seen in Italy, a sort of new party coming from nowhere, not apparently standing for anything very much, with a sense of humour, not sort of nasty fascist, but very much the populist right. My view, very strongly about UKIP, is we've got to respect the fact that a quarter of the electorate have voted for them. You've got to listen to what they've got to say. The policies are extremely vague. Well, that's a challenge to us to debate with them and get them to be more specific. And I think when it becomes apparent there isn't a great deal behind it, the pendulums will back. But no, we've got to engage properly with it.
Well, that is the question, though, is what engaging with them really means. Now, in a sense, we already know what the Conservatives think it means because the Prime Minister preemptively moved to try and deal with the UKIP threat. That's why in part, we saw the speech on a possible referendum about EU membership. That's why in the last week we heard him say, oh, well, look, if Parliament needs to have a vote on that in the next few months before the general election, he'd do that. That's why we had, I suspect, a rather tougher message, for example, on the prison regime. We've had a tougher message on immigration, and we'll see that next week when we get the Queen's speech. So in a sense, we've already got the Conservative reaction. What we're not quite clear about is how the other parties will react to this new threat.
Can I try to... I mean, we all agree on this or not, but UKIP have been able to write things in the manifesto. I was looking at their transport manifesto from last time round. It turns out that they were in favour of 3 high-speed rail lines. Well, they now go around campaigning against the one that Parliament's legislating for. And actually nobody says, well, hold on, that's completely at odds with what was in your manifesto. Usually political parties have to be held to account for their manifestos in a way of much more scrutiny, both by the press and by the political parties. I think that today's those results suggest that that is a reasonable expectation for UKIP as well.
The UKIP point, the policy point, we will come back to because we hope to be talking to UKIP in a few minutes. So your policy points we can discuss at that point. I'm going to join Jeremy once again for some analysis from him. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi, Hugh. Yes, just really looking at where we are at this point and going to our map on the floor here. So this was the shape of the county councils as we went into these elections and the unitary authorities. And you could see these swathes of blue. This is how they were left pretty much in 2009. And then this is what we've got so far. And we're flashing where there's been a change. So you can see Gloucestershire, no overall control. And you can see Lincolnshire as well, no overall control here. And Darbishire, as we were hearing from Matthew Amberley-Waller, will eventually go red. So, where are the parties in terms of their share in key wards? We have about 1,400 wards we look at. We're not even halfway in terms of the number of wards we've got in, but we think we can give you these figures now. So you see Conservatives in first place on 35%. That's where they are. Bear in mind, this is very, very Conservative territory, a lot of it. So 35% is where we have them at the moment in our key wards. The figure everyone's talking about is this second one here. Of course, it is UKIP on 22%. UKIP on 22%. Pushing Labour into third on 20%. And the Lib Dems now in fourth on 14%. Again, our key wards, this figure will possibly change as the day goes on. Could stabilise, could stay the same. 4% for the Greens, 5% for the others. That's where we are at the moment. Let me show you, if I can, the change in share since 2009 and see what's been happening here. So we will have a look for this UKIP column and see how much their vote has gone up. The purple column is the key here. What has happened to them? And the answer is we got them up 17% since 2009. Now you also see here, when you're looking at what were pretty good elections for the Conservatives 4 years ago, they are now down 9%. So they're very much hurting there. Their coalition partners, however, are down a touch more. The Liberal Democrats down 11%. And also, we see here with Labour up 7% on 2009. But we have to bear in mind, 2009 was an absolutely terrible year for Labour under Gordon Brown. As you've been saying in the studio, they got 20% of the vote share. So plus 7% does not represent any dramatic recovery for Labour. So there we are. And again, all eyes on this UKIP figure, 17% up in our analysis of the key wards. Hugh.
Jeremy, thanks very much, and that's very useful because we want to talk a little more about that UKIP performance in the context of the other parties too, and where the progress has been made, because some of the progress has been more spectacular in some areas than in others. Clearly, it's not been a uniform performance. We're going to go to Doncaster because I'm going to talk to my colleague Len Tingle, who's there, but he's keeping an eye too on other areas, including Lincolnshire. Len, what can you tell us?
Well, here in Doncaster, this is the election that Labour has been pulling out all the stops to win. It's Ed Miliband's backyard. All the other MPs locally are Labour. 2/3 of the councillors are Labour. But 4 years ago, the little-known English Democrat, Peter Davies, squeaked in. He's standing again to defend. Labour's candidate, Ros Jones, has been knocking on so many doors that the skin on her knuckles has gone. But we're getting very close to the result of the first preference votes. Remember, here in mayoral elections, people get 2 votes. They count the first ones. If nobody's got over 50%, you go through to a runoff of the top 2 candidates. Behind me, we can see the first preference vote stacks. It's so close between Labour and Peter Davies, now standing as an independent, that they will go through to the runoff. That's when it gets interesting, because the other 8 candidates in this big field, their second preference votes will go to those 2 candidates. Most of them, frankly, are no friends of Labour. So Labour's going to have to be quite a way ahead in that first count if it's going to have a chance of winning in the second runoff. It's going to be very, very tight.
We'll be keeping an eye on that, Len, and we'll be back with you as well. But a word before you go, not just about the mayoral, but a word too about one of the interesting results overnight. And Lincolnshire clearly is one of the most interesting results for lots of reasons. What was your take on that?
Astonishing was the words that I got from UKIP supporters from Lincolnshire. I was talking to them just a couple of days ago, and they were suggesting maybe we'd win 4 or 5. 16 was beyond their wildest dreams. And remember, this is a council that for 20-odd years has been run by the Conservatives. Never thought that UKIP would be the second largest party and would knock the Conservatives off their perch. But it is an area of fertile ground for UKIP, because this is an area where there's been a big influx of agricultural workers from Eastern Europe, and there have been a few demonstrations in the past, not set up by UKIP, but by local people who are worried about whether or not there are enough educational and health facilities to cope with that. So, as I say, that was fertile ground for UKIP, but maybe even they are surprised at just how successful they've been.
Len, thanks very much once again. Len Tingle there for us. I want to stay on the theme of where UKIP have made some gains, because it just opens up the debate a little more. And then in just a few minutes, we may be able to talk to UKIP City of London spokesman Stephen Wolfe. So with that in mind, I'm going to go to Taunton, and I'm going to talk to my colleague Paul Bartrop there about Gloucester. It's about Paul, you're in Gloucester, aren't you?
I'm in Gloucester, but I can talk to you about Taunton as well, because both the counties of Somerset and Gloucestershire were very fruitful for the United Kingdom Independence Party last night. Yes, we gathered the votes in and we counted through till the small hours. And the net result was 3 gains to the UK Independence Party here in Gloucestershire, 3 gains down the road in Somerset. Now, in Somerset's case, that wasn't enough to knock the Tories off their perch. They remain the largest party just by a whisker, so they keep control in Somerset. But here in Gloucestershire, it's gone to no overall control. Now, the council leader, he's been around here this morning, Mark Hawthorne, is, well, no longer the council leader in effect. He's still the leader of the largest group. The Conservatives do have more seats than any other party. But now this council is up for negotiation. The talking starts now. It's not that the other parties didn't do reasonably well. Labour made gains. They doubled their share on the council from a fairly slender 5. They went up to 9. And the Lib Dems did actually better than they have in most other areas. They made some progress, they made some gains. But undoubtedly it was UKIP who've caused a bit of a tremor in the political landscape around here. A short distance from where we're standing over in the Forest of Dean, they picked up no less than 3 seats. They also, incidentally, in a by-election for the District Council, won a straight race against the Conservatives. So it's all up for grabs here now. And I will just mention one other thing, because this is salient to what the politicians in here are feeling and discussing today. It was all done on a very, very low turnout. 31% of people voted in Gloucestershire. Now, the previous lowest level for a county council election here had been 41%. And if I tell you, over in Cheltenham, it got as low as 19% in a couple of wards. It wasn't a good day for democracy, but it has been a good day for the UK Independence Party.
Paul, once again in Gloucester, thanks very much. Paul Bartrop for us there on the result, not just in Gloucester, but mentioned Somerset too. Right, so now that we've seen the areas where some of those UKIP gains have been made, let's talk to Stephen Wolfe, who's UKIP City of London spokesman and joins us now. Mr Wolfe, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Thanks very much. We had Mr Farage in earlier telling us that this was all about sending a message to the 3 gentlemen sitting next to me here representing their parties, because in his view, they're not listening, UKIP is listening. Is that the secret?
Yes, it is. And I think you've seen today from the result in Lincolnshire, the really hard work that our members and those who have now won council seats have undertaken over the past 2 to 3 years. We've been knocking on doors. We've been listening to the small businessmen. We've been listening to the families as they're taking their children to school and asking them what are their concerns. And when they've told us, we've now started to put that into our policies, and we've created the policies that they want to have enacted. And unfortunately, the 3 political parties are not listening.
There are lots of sighs in the studio when you were talking there. Stephen, from people next to me may be suggesting that your policies don't quite stack up. Would you like to say what you were saying earlier, Mr Shapps?
Well, I was pointing out that now that UKIP have done well, congratulations, by the way, on where you have, that it does mean that the party will obviously be subject to the kind of scrutiny that the other parties are. And where you have policies which don't quite stack up, I was giving the example of UKIP campaigning against high-speed rail 2 in some constituencies, but then when you go back to their previous manifesto, they were campaigning for 3 high-speed 2 lines. And these are the types of things which are going to, I think now, come under greater scrutiny naturally.
Nick, what do you think?
Well, let's just take an example of policy on immigration. Can you clear up for us? Are you saying that when you say there'll be a 5-year freeze on permanent settlement, that no French people, Spanish, German people will be able to move to the UK if UKIP had the immigration policy it wants, and indeed that British people, therefore, presumably as a result, also couldn't move to Spain, Germany and France and elsewhere?
Well, no, I think there's a misunderstanding of what you mean by the 5-year freeze. We have effectively said that immigration should be controlled both from within the European Union and outside of the European Union. And by our 5-year freeze, we're simply saying you don't get the rights of residence, and therefore you don't have automatic access to benefits or free healthcare, for example. We're not here to stop people of talent or skill to come into the United Kingdom. That's why we want to have a controlled system.
But if Romanian and Bulgarians, therefore, did want to move in the numbers that your party has warned they might, they'd be free to do it, but they just wouldn't be able to have access to some of the services you've said.
Well, they would only be free to do it if they were able to pass the visa point system that we've got, or that's part of our policy, not the system that we have now.
You mean to pass the system that is already in place under the government that you're opposing?
Well, under the government system now, obviously anybody from the European Union can come in, and you know that, and we know that, and so do the panellists that you have there today. There's very little that those 3 political parties can do to stop the uncontrolled immigration coming from Romania or Bulgaria.
Yeah, I'm trying to work out what you'd do to stop the immigration from Bulgaria and Romania. I'm still not clear.
Well, of course, one of our first points that we would do is we want to withdraw from the European Union. Once we've withdrawn from the European Union...
Forgive me, that's why I asked you whether you'd remove the right of European citizens to come here, and presumably they would then remove the right of British citizens to move to the EU.
I think it's your use of the word remove the right. They won't have the right under the European Union to be able to come here freely without having to comply with the rules that we will put in place. They will still have a right to apply to come to the United Kingdom, as would anybody from Africa or China or India. We want to create a fair immigration system that is applicable to everybody in the world. It's a global world. We need talent globally, not just from a part of the world in Europe which is declining and can often bring us just low-skilled workers.
The reason I push you on it, and thanks for the answers, is when you go onto the UKIP website, and it's arguably the most important policy UKIP has in terms of driving voters, it describes your immigration policy as currently under review and update.
Absolutely, of course. All the political parties are having to review their political policies that were enacted for the 2010 general election. We've had to take into consideration the changes that have occurred over the past few years, including when we look at this, the economy and collapsing in the way that it is. So we, just like any sensible political party, have to review our policies, whether it's on HS2 or high-speed trains, as Grant has suggested.
But on immigration, forgive me interrupting, on immigration, it means that if a voter were to say to you, would there be far fewer immigrants, you can give a sort of blanket, yes, of course, we'd like there to be, but actually you can't tell us how, or the numbers, or when.
Well, we are trying to say that we would limit to 50,000 a year, although our policies now, looking at this, having listened to business, they say that number is probably too low, possibly 100,000, hence the reason for the review. So there is a physical number for you. Would we say that we would stop immigration coming from the European Union? Yes, but only for those who have the open door immigration at the moment. They have to apply. It's very clear.
But forgive me just making the point, many of the people who've come to you because they think the established parties haven't got it right and have broken their promises. And you've just told us that the manifesto you ran on at the last election said there'd be 50,000 immigrants a year coming in, but you're doubling that to 100,000 as a result of a review. Now, it seems to me, are you not liable to find the same problem that the established political parties have, which is when people look at the detail, they go, oh, it's not quite what we thought it was going to be?
No, I didn't say that we were doubling it. I say that the business has suggested that we ought to double it, and that is one of the things that any sensible party who is considering policy that is important to building the economic growth of this country must do so, and that is what UKIP is doing.
Sadiq Khan, one of the problems here, of course, is, as UKIP has said all along, they're making inroads into some areas where Labour have been traditionally strong, because Labour, as they put it, made a hash of the whole immigration question when they were in power. They lost control of it, in the phrase used by UKIP many times. Is that something you've found when you've been campaigning? And that's one of your vulnerabilities as far as UKIP is concerned.
Well, can I begin by congratulating UKIP on the good results last night, and to in the studio directly, as I did to Nigel Farage. Secondly, UKIP are picking up voters from all three main parties. Of course, you've done the number crunching, a lot more from the Tories, but we mustn't be complacent. Thirdly, it's very arrogant when you call a party that's picking up a quarter of the votes, their supporters of the party, clowns or fruitcakes. It's disparaging. And for those who've bothered to vote and have voted UKIP, what sort of message does it send them? Now, Vincent's alluded to the anti-politics feeling around Europe. The challenge we have is to inspire people to leave their homes and vote for one of our parties. And you're right, Hugh. We've got to fess up that in government we got some of our immigration policy wrong. We should have had longer transitional arrangements for the other countries, the accession countries. We did for Romania and Bulgaria, the maximum possible we did for those two countries, and they run out at the end of this year. And so next year will pose all sorts of challenges for us. But I think it's really important to start by congratulating UKIP for the results they got last night, and to say to their voters and those who voted for UKIP for the first time, I promise you that we will do our best over the next 2 years to persuade you to give trust again to the Labour Party.
Vince Cable, do you have a sense yourself from your own campaigning whether the UKIP surge is driven specifically by the immigration question, or is it more general unhappiness, unease and just disgruntlement with economic conditions and all the rest of it?
Well, it's a bit of each, and clearly if you're in difficult economic conditions, which we are and have been since the collapse of the banking system, then immigration becomes a more acute issue because people are worried about jobs and general insecurity. But I thought the exchanges Nick Robinson and the UKIP spokesman were quite revealing, because they make it very clear that in order to deal with this visceral issue, which UKIP have exploited, you cannot deal with it unless you control migration within the European Union. In order to do that, you've got to lead the European Union. And not just that, but the European Economic Area. So this idea that somehow or other you have some comfortable free trade area, I mean, it is a chimera. I mean, it's not something they could deliver, but it does remind us that there is a clear choice here. You either stay within the European Union with all its faults and try to reform it, or you just get out completely with all the uncertainty and costs that are involved.
You'll have just seen on the screen there the latest result we have in, and we've been waiting for those to come. Hopefully this will be the first of several, and it is that the Conservatives have lost control of Warwickshire. Emily, any more details?
Yeah, this is how it looks then. 24 for the Conservatives, Labour on 18, the Lib Dems on 3, the Greens on 2. We haven't had the final count-ins. There are still some wards to go, but this is the result. And if I show you what happened overnight then, that big hit, the Conservatives down 13, Labour on 12. That was the number that they lost last time round, so they'll be very pleased to have seen those gains of 12. This is a part of the world where UKIP didn't field many candidates at all, one of their smaller slates. The Greens, we know, took the scalp of the Conservative council leader here, but this is what's happened. It's a council that has often been in no overall control, so it's not a massive surprise that it wasn't taken outright by Labour. They've never actually had it. But here is the result as things stand. No overall control. We can see the Conservatives are now short by 6. That is the final result in the last few seconds. That has just come clear. So I think Labour will be feeling pretty positive about this, even though it hasn't been an outright take.
Emily, thanks, Nick.
We've talked about it being a mixed picture around the country. The last figures I have, and forgive me, I haven't checked in recent minutes, was that Labour's vote had gone up by about 16% in Warwickshire. So it does show there are parts of the country, and I think Ed Miliband will want to visit them and highlight them, where he'll say, look how well we're doing, where UKIP is a big presence. There are other parts of the country where they're clearly failing to meet the sorts of targets. Earlier I was telling you that their vote share had dropped by almost 7% against the Gordon Brown performance in Essex, 7% in Essex. So there are parts where they're doing really well. Warwickshire, Staffordshire's another example for Labour doing well. Others where it's really not happening for them.
And the good news, Nick, in those parts of the country where we're doing well is those are the areas where there are constituencies we've got to win back from the Conservatives. And so the progress in Warwickshire, where marginal seats we've got to win back, Staffordshire, marginal seats we've got to win back, are very, very good.
OK, let's bring in Tim Lawton, the Conservative MP, former Children's Minister. Tim, good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us. What do you make of it so far?
Well, I think it's a kick in the pants, mostly by UKIP, but it's a kick in the pants for everybody, not just us. And I think it's interesting, just listening to your UKIP spokesman, they've done very well. There's no good denying it. You've just had a conversation with him all about immigration, and he started throwing around some figures with a 100% error margin. But immigration has nothing to do with the county council, and yesterday we had county council elections. And I think this whole election campaign by UKIP, and they are much more of a threat in our part of the country, and we're awaiting our results, and I feel we'll lose some seats to UKIP from some very good councillors. But they've been campaigning on Europe, on immigration, on international aid. They're against Europe, they're against immigration, they're against international aid. We don't actually know what they are for, and certainly I struggled a lot with UKIP people to say, well, what are your policies? What are you going to do locally? What's your education policy, which is what county council elections are all about? And answer came there, none. So they've really got to come under some scrutiny now to see what people actually think they are about, if they are to be taken seriously in the future.
I'm just going to put you a quote from defeated Conservative councillor in Hampshire, actually, Alexis McAvoy, writing, I think, for the Daily Telegraph, saying this: "I lost my seat in the UKIP surge because David Cameron has ditched our core values and no one believes he will give us a referendum on Europe." How widespread is that view?
Well, I don't think that's fair, and I sympathise with Alexis, and she'll be one of many Conservative councillors, good Conservative councillors, I fear, who will lose their seat. I think there's a real frustration with the electorate. We are going through unprecedentedly tough economic times. It's going to take a long time to get the economy back on track. We are going in the right direction, but people are having their patience stretched. And then on subjects like Europe, David Cameron, in that announcement in January, went further than any other Conservative leader, even Mrs Thatcher, in promising a straightforward in-out referendum on our continued membership of Europe. If you are under the age of 55, like I am just about, you have never had the opportunity to vote on a membership of Europe. And it's very different now to what it was back in 1975 when there was a referendum. We are going to have that referendum if there is a Conservative government. There's no question about that. And voting UKIP rather than Conservative is going to make that referendum less likely at the next election. So do you really want to see a referendum on Europe, which they can actually urge people to vote against, and many Conservatives may as well, or are they just posturing? Because you will, under a Conservative government, have a referendum on our future relationship with Europe, in or out. So that's something David Cameron has promised. There are some other things like family values which have been mentioned, things which we stand for, things that were in our manifesto, things like the transferable married tax allowance, which I'm very much in favour of. We've promised. We're taking a long time to deliver. We must deliver. And that's why people are saying we're a bit disappointed, because some of the things we look to Conservatives to do, that David Cameron, that you and in your manifesto promised to do, we've yet to see. So can we please get on with it? And I think that's a real message coming out of these elections too.
Tim Lawton, good of you to join us. Thanks very much. Former Children's Minister, Conservative MP, joined in the studio by Professor Vernon Bogdanor. We haven't ejected Vince Cable. Vince Cable has gone to a meeting in his constituency, but Professor Bogdanor, Professor of Contemporary History at King's College London.
That's right.
That's right. Good to have you with us. Is this a blip or is this a change in the landscape? How do you see it?
It's a very remarkable day, I think, in British politics. Normally in mid-term, you expect the government to do badly in local elections, the opposition to do well, and frankly, it doesn't have much national effect. It's forgotten fairly rapidly. But here the voters are using a local election to send a national message to politicians at Westminster, because after all, UKIP's main policy plank is that Britain should leave the European Union. Now, all the opinion polls we have show that at least a very large minority of the voters, and in some polls a majority of voters, share that view, but none of the party leaders believe that we ought to leave the European Union. Now, an even more important issue than that in the minds of many voters is immigration from the EU member states. And where feeling about immigration is strong, as in Lincolnshire, the UKIP have done well. And this is also a problem for all of the main parties, because, of course, you can't limit immigration from the EU countries while you remain in the European Union. The Treaty of Rome insists on the free movement of peoples. So there's a very powerful message being sent to the voters that they're not being listened to by the party leaders. And I think it'll have very great effects. We might even see them in the Queen's speech next week. It's possible that David Cameron might produce a bill providing for a referendum, a binding referendum, before the general election so that no future government can really get out of it without considerable embarrassment. So we may see changes as soon as next week.
But commitments on a referendum, I mean, not the legislative one, which as you say, is much more recent. I've been there for a while. So in that case, what is the issue there? Why are people still not registering the fact, oh, well, if I do actually want a referendum on whether we want to stay in or out of the EU, actually, I've got a party leader, and David Cameron is offering me that. I'm still going over to UKIP. So what are the issues here?
Well, if we had Nigel Farage in the studio, I expect he'd say that David Cameron promised a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, but we haven't had one. Now, David Cameron had a perfectly good reason for not giving that referendum, because by the time he came to power, it had already been ratified. But that didn't affect the folk memory that the people haven't been asked their views on Europe since 1975. So it's a serious problem.
There's another problem, of course, which is the coalition, which is David Cameron hinted that he'd be satisfied with Parliament voting on the issue of an EU referendum, but there are two problems. One, if he had such a vote, he'd lose it, because Labour and the Liberal Democrats would combine and vote him down. Secondly, this is a coalition government, and the coalition controls what proposals are put in the Queen's speech. If the Prime Minister now turns to Nick Clegg, his deputy, and says, I've got an idea, I'd like a bill next Wednesday in the Queen's speech to have a referendum on the EU. I haven't called Nick Clegg's people, I haven't spoken to Mr Clegg, but I'm just going to predict to you that he might just say no.
Well, a further consequence of what's happening today, I think, are much greater strains within the coalition government between a Eurosceptic, broadly Eurosceptic Conservative Party and a pro-European Liberal Democrat Party.
You'll be glad to know that Mr Farage, who was with us earlier, has had time to have a little bit of refreshment before he went off for a rest. And there he was earlier. I think this is just round the corner here at Westminster, so a bit of a photo opportunity. I'm not saying he was beating a door to the pub. I'm not suggesting that at all, Nick. OK? But he's having a nice time, clearly.
It is worth knowing, for people who don't know Westminster and regard it somewhere you watch on the telly, Nigel Farage has just been circling within about half a mile, probably less, about a quarter of a mile of this studio, since about 8 o'clock this morning. He's been followed wherever he goes to cameras. He talks to us, he talks to our competitor television stations, he's talked to people abroad, he goes to the pub. Normally, political leaders this stage, they head off to a place that they've won, they take some cameras with them. I don't think you'll see Mr Farage leave this area at all. He even took the time, I'm told, to speak to every single BBC local radio station, something we normally find a little bit hard to persuade party leaders to do all in one go. He is milking his success and drinking to it.
Well, let's see what Anne McElvoy and Steve Richards make of it, because they are two of our prominent political commentators in the press, and they're on the green. I'm assuming they haven't been to the pub, Steve and Anne's case. But what's your take so far? We have nine declarations in, Anne and Steve, 26 to go. So the bulk of these results will come this afternoon. But so far, Anne, what do you make of it?
Well, the direction of travel does look quite clear, even if some of the details change later on. This has been Nigel Farage's night. And of course, the problem that he's left is it makes David Cameron look like he's someone who tried to move his party to the centre, but he doesn't control the centre ground. Labour have not done too badly here, not brilliantly, but not too badly. Mr Cameron is therefore fighting in the centre ground against a lot of competition, but his right flank just looks like it is being eaten away remorselessly by UKIP.
Steve, what is your thought?
I think this has been the ultimate anti-politics election, and I don't support this anti-politics mood in the country. I think voters are wrong to feel so alienated by the mainstream political parties, but they do. And this presents them all with a big problem, but specifically the Conservatives. We know what happens when a vote on one part of the spectrum is fractured in any way at all, because we saw it with the SDP and Labour in the 80s. And although, unquestionably, UKIP has appeal in some Labour areas, it will be more to the Conservatives that this is a threat. And there's not much Cameron can say or do to stop it. It's out there. He's part of conventional politics. Voters are looking for an alternative in Nigel Farage having a drink with his pint of beer. And I think that will still be around at the time of the general election. So this is a significant moment, I think.
Steve, Vernon Bogdanov's not totally convinced. Let's just hear from him.
Well, I don't think it is an anti-politics vote. It's a vote for certain specific policies which UKIP stands for, whether rightly or wrongly. Greater degree of Euroscepticism, leaving Europe, stronger control on immigration. There'd be much more reason, I think, to say that in the past some of the votes for the Liberal Democrats were a protest vote, because although the Liberal Democrats had a wide range of policies, they didn't have one
specifically clear policy in the way that UKIP does. And if you say it's an anti-politics vote, you have to explain why it's gone to UKIP rather than to any other of the minor parties. It's a clear message going to the Westminster politicians, and I think they'd be rather foolish to ignore it.
Nick?
I'm going to disagree with the Professor, actually. I think it's true that he's found in Europe and immigration key things, but I give you one fascinating little poll detail from the other day when there was an opinion poll done, bear with me, on the measles epidemic. It discovered that 5 times more UKIP voters feared the MMR jab than other voters. What does that tell you? You may say nothing at all. I think what it tells you is that the mindset of a UKIP voter, yes, maybe someone who agrees with them on Europe or on immigration or all sorts of other issues, maybe locally, wind farms, whatever, but is anti-establishment, is suspicious of the messages they're told by the men in suits. They reject what they are getting from people who they think have had a chance to run the country, whatever their political colour, and haven't done it very badly. So in that sense, I think Steve Richards is absolutely right. It is an anti-politics vote.
I'll go back to Anne and Steve who are on the green for us. And what does this mean for Conservative strategy in particular, and partly Labour, heading to 2015?
I think there's loud ambulance go past. I think it really means that Mr Cameron has to think quite quickly about what he wants to do with this referendum offer, because he made the referendum offer after the next election on Europe, but clearly that hasn't been good enough. I do think the Tory response to UKIP has been pretty lamentable, and certainly Ken Clarke going out like a blunderbuss this week, telling you were faintly sort of stupid or a closet racist in terms, if you were thinking of voting for it, I think caused an immense backlash. So I think they've got to go back to basics, and they are basically going to have to try and co-opt UKIP voters. That's very difficult for a leader who's set himself up as a moderniser who wanted to move into and colonise the centre ground. His first question is, does he try to get a referendum through before the next election? Can he get that through the Commons? But if he looks like he's lost the momentum on that, then I think he gives that issue, and I partly agree with Steve on the anti-politics mood, but we know what it's really about. It's about the EU, and it's about immigration. And unless he moves on those 2 issues, I think you'll see that UKIP will do him serious damage.
Steve, do you agree?
I do, and I think it explains why both David Cameron and Ed Miliband in different ways haven't got fully developed public voices. I mean, Cameron is a talented politician, so why has he not resonated more? And it's because he cannot quite decide whether he wants to be this centre ground, he used the word progressive when he was in opposition, or now whether he has to somehow or other woo those going over to UKIP. As Anne said, he's got to get those votes back. How he does that and has a credible, coherent political voice, I don't know the answer to. And in different ways, Ed Miliband has got similar sorts of dilemmas as to his public pitch. And I think we're in a period where these national leaders are themselves confused at the moment as to how they win that general election. And the UKIP phenomenon will reinforce that. You see, just in 10 seconds, I disagree with Vernon. To some extent, David Cameron, in policy terms, has tried to address the concerns of these UKIP voters on immigration and Europe, and they're not listening to it.
OK.
And this is a real problem for us.
Steve and Anne, thanks very much. We've had a result in, thank you both, from Cumbria. Emily?
Yeah, I suspect this will be slightly disappointing for Labour. It has remained in overall control. This was one of their hopes for the night. They lost 15 seats here last time round. And if I show you what happened overnight, they've get back 2/3 of those losses. They made back 10, but they haven't done enough to take control. Conservatives taking the hit. They're down 12 councillors. The Lib Dems gaining a seat here. Don't forget there's an important Westminster parliamentary battle around Carlisle and Barrow. So possibly some disappointment there, but it remains in overall control. Hugh.
Emily, thanks very much. So, Nick, very soon we'll be stopping for BBC News at 1 and we'll be taking a little break, but actually going through the afternoon we've got 25 results to come in, so there's plenty to wait for.
There's a lot to wait for, and as we're finding, there isn't a common pattern. You're seeing different results in different parts of the country, and what you're hearing from the political parties is what their number crunchers are doing is saying, what does that mean for marginal seat A or B? So these results exist at a lot of different levels. Yes, who runs your town hall, but also the number crunchers going, are we going to win that seat in 2 years' time, or are we now way off where we should be? And we'll look at some of that.
Grand Chaps, Sadiq Khan and Vernon Bogdanor. I'm really sorry we're out of time, but it's good of you to join us. We'll be picking up, of course, after BBC News at 1. Nick will be talking to you later as well, and Emily and Jeremy Vine too. We're going to take a pause. 1 o'clock news coming up on BBC One. and on the BBC News channel with Simon McCoy, and we'll be back at 2 o'clock with all the very latest results. As I say, 25 local authorities yet to declare. At the moment, Conservatives holding on to 5, they've lost control of 3. Labour on 0 at the moment, Lib Dems 2, no overall control, hung councils 5 at the moment, an increase of 3 on last time, 10 declared already. Join us at 2 o'clock, lots more to come.
Semi-finals action in World Championship snooker back here on BBC Two at 3, following Vote 2013.
Hello, very good afternoon. It's 2 o'clock. Welcome to the BBC's Election Centre. In the next couple of hours, we're expecting the bulk of the local election results. 20 declared now, with 15 to go, well over halfway. The contest was yesterday, of course. The votes were cast yesterday. 34 councils in England, 1 in Wales. It is the biggest electoral test of the year and the biggest celebration so far, I think it's fair to say, have been in the UKIP camp, because their leader, Nigel Farage, has been celebrating in his usual style, celebrating a big surge in UKIP support, dozens of gains, most of the councils yet to declare, and we've got 15 to go, so we'll be talking about UKIP's performance so far. What about the Conservatives? Well, David Cameron on a visit to Oxford University today, that's where he's been, but he is due to respond to the results, I'm told, within the next hour or so. He'll have something to say about the Conservative performance, and who knows, he may have something to say about the other parties too, including UKIP. But the Conservatives have lost overall control of several councils. At the moment, 6 of them. They're hanging on to 11, so that's the tally so far. That was South Shields last night. That's the parliamentary by-election, which Labour did well in. They retained their control of South Shields, but UKIP took second place with a strong performance. Labour's share of the vote was constant, but the majority was halved. Well, talking of South Shields, the Lib Dems did rather badly there. Elsewhere, it's been a bit of a, well, I think a patchy performance is how I put it. Some gains. They have been affected as well by the UKIP surge, not just the Conservatives affected by UKIP, other parties too. We'll have plenty to talk about. Nick Robinson is with me, the BBC's political editor. We are joined too by Michael Gove and by Tom Watson and by Lord Newby. We'll be with you in a second, gentlemen. Thank you very much. More analysis to come, because now we are really into a bit of rush of results. So with no further ado, here's Jane with the news update.
Thanks very much, Hugh. Good afternoon. The leader of the UK Independence Party, Nigel Farage, has claimed that the results of yesterday's local elections have sent a shockwave through the establishment. Many votes have yet to be counted, but so far UKIP is winning about a quarter of the vote in the wards where it has candidates standing. The party also pushed the Conservatives into third place in the South Shields parliamentary by-election, which was held by Labour. Here's our political correspondent, Chris Mason.
They don't have any MPs, they don't run any big councils, but this is a big moment for UKIP. So far, they've won around 1 in every 4 votes cast, making them impossible to ignore.
Go, Nigel, go!
The champagne's flowed for the party once described by the Prime Minister as loonies, fruitcakes and closet racists.
We've been abused by everybody, the entire establishment, and now they're shocked and stunned that we're getting over 25% of the vote everywhere we stand across the country. This is a real sea change in British politics.
12,000.
Labour did hold the one parliamentary seat up for election, a seat they've held for generations, South Shields. Labour won here too on North Tyneside, where its candidate for mayor beat the Conservatives. But both these victories were must-wins. Overall, the party's performance has been mixed.
Some people who haven't voted before have come out and voted UKIP, but I think it is a party of protest, and I don't think it's a party of government.
The Conservatives lost control of Lincolnshire and Gloucestershire because of UKIP's gains, posing questions for the Tory leadership.
We hear you, we get what you're saying, we understand people want to see change, they're impatient for it, and I certainly want to kind of make the point straight off the bat that, you know, we appreciate that people are anxious to see problems fixed in this country and things move on.
All the big parties now have to decide how to face up to the UKIP threat. Already, the insults have gone.
I think there is a bit of unease about how politics is done in this country, and Nigel Farage, in a way that Boris Johnson, I think, does as well, does connect a bit with some of that unease.
These elections will be remembered for UKIP's breakthrough, as small as the party still remains. And for Nigel Farage, there's only ever been one way to celebrate. Chris Mason, BBC News.
And now the rest of today's main stories and the jury in the trial of Mark Bridger, who's accused of murdering 5-year-old April Jones, has been shown CCTV footage of his movements around the time she disappeared. Mark Bridger is shown buying alcohol in a Spar store, and his Land Rover is seen outside his home and being driven around the local area. He denies murdering April Jones, who disappeared in October in North Wales. The Royal Bank of Scotland returned to profit in the first quarter of this year. The bank, which is more than 80% owned by the taxpayer, made a pre-tax profit of £826 million. That compares with a £1.5 billion loss in the same period last year. The chairman of RBS, Sir Philip Hampton, says the bank should be ready for a return to the private sector by the middle of 2014. A man who provided security protection for Rebecca Brooks, the former chief executive of News International, is being charged with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. David Johnson is accused of concealing a computer and other items and will appear before Westminster magistrates next Wednesday. The charge comes as Scotland Yard continues its investigations into phone hacking and payments to public officials. The special prosecutor in Pakistan investigating the murder of the former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto has been shot dead in Islamabad. Men on motorbikes attacked Chowdhury Zulfikar in front of his home. He died later in hospital. Mr Zulfikar was also the main lawyer in a case related to the terrorist attacks in Mumbai in 2008. And those are the other main stories here this afternoon. Right now, let's return to all the team at Westminster for the latest on the local election results. Back to you.
Jane, thanks very much. We'll have some more news later on. Right now, I should say, in the past hour, we've had a bit of a flow of results after a slow morning. I think it's fair to say that would be an understatement. We had quite a few overnight and then a couple this morning as we came up to lunchtime. But suddenly, we've had a bit of a flow of results. So let's go to Emily straight away for the latest on what we've had. Emily?
Thanks, Hugh. Yes, they're coming in thick and fast here now. These are the places where we've had results. If I update them by pressing 2013, you can see what's happened. And that is the most dramatic result we're going to bring you this afternoon. Norfolk has been taken out of Conservative control. No overall control is shown by this grey. Lancashire has gone into no overall control too. That has been taken away from the Conservatives. East Sussex similarly gone into no overall control. Darbishire, as you can see, the first take in red for Labour from no overall control. That was a Tory gain last time round. Wiltshire stayed, Shropshire stayed, Worcestershire stayed and West Sussex have all stayed within Conservative control. So let me just show you the result in Norfolk, because this is quite dramatic when we go in. Now, as you will see from the screen, we have the result. They haven't quite finished the final counting in the wards. So bear with us. What we know at this stage is that it cannot be taken by the Conservatives. Conservatives on 40, but look at these results. UKIP on 15, Labour on 14, the Lib Dems on 10. UKIP in second place, as we saw in Lincolnshire. Let me show you what happened overnight there. This is somewhere that I should mention has been held by the Conservatives for 9 out of the last 10 elections. So it's a real shock to see them out. The Conservatives down by 20 counts as UKIP up 14, Labour on 11. And I'm going to play around now and show you the share of the vote. This isn't obviously the number of seats because it's a first-past-the-post system, but it shows you how it breaks up, and it shows you the Conservatives still the largest council here in terms of share, but UKIP just above Labour there in second place. place. I'm also going to show you one more result, Lancashire. If I update this now, and I know we're going to go there in a second for a little bit of the analysis, Labour have not managed to take this. They lost 27 councillors here in 2009. It was somewhere that they very much wanted to retake, and you can see how close they were. They're on 39, short by 4, but they have deprived the Conservatives of control here. If I show you what happened overnight, they've gained 23. They've made back almost everything that they lost last time round, but it wasn't quite enough. They have gained in Rossingdale. There are a lot of quite tight parliamentary marginals here, so they'll be pleased to see the inroads they're making. Hasn't been enough to turn that one red. Plenty more results coming in.
Emily, thanks very much. Well, we certainly want to talk about Norfolk because that's a very significant result. Lancashire too, because that opens up a couple of other arguments for us. So let's go straight to Preston. I just want to have a live update there from Arif Ansari, who's keeping an eye on Lancashire for us. What's your take on what's happened there, Arif?
Yes, good afternoon, Hugh. It is a good result for Labour, but not quite as good as they were hoping for. If we look at what happened, Labour are now on 39 seats, the Tories have 35. That means Labour gained 23 seats in this county council election. A lot of gains from a very low base, but it wasn't the magic 26 that they needed for control. They are 3 seats away from control, leaving the Liberal Democrats and other parties with the balance of power. And here's something interesting. We're hearing from the Conservatives that they are not conceding. They're hoping that they're going to be able to remain in control here in Lancashire. So there's going to be some political horse trading going on over the weekend with news emerging of whoever it is that's going to lead Lancashire.
Arif, thanks very much for the update. Since we were on air earlier, we've also had results from Devon, among other places. So let's go and talk to Martin Oates, our political editor, BBC South West, who's in Cornwall for us. Martin, bring us up to date there. What happened?
Well, over in Devon, the Tories, who controlled the council previously, have stayed in control. They've not just held off the challenge from their traditional rivals, the Lib Dems. The Lib Dems have had a terrible day, really, their worst showing since the 1970s. But there again, UKIP really the big story. They're second in terms of vote share in Devon, and they've ended up with 4 councillors. Doesn't sound much, but compared to essentially the flatlining they've done in these local elections, comparable elections previously, it's a very significant breakthrough there.
And when we look at the balance of the other parties there, Martin, I mean, again, just go through a couple of the performances for us. Who's happy and who's disappointed?
Well, Labour have done reasonably well. They've got 7 councillors. I mean, traditionally their support tends to be focused in a number of small areas in Devon. A Green councillor elected. A Green councillor was elected last time, but she defected to Labour. So clearly it was the Green vote rather than some sort of personal vote which held true and put that Green councillor in place in Totnes in South Devon.
Martin, once again, thanks very much. Martin Oates there for us in the South West. We'll have more a little later on. So, Nick with me and my guests in the studio too. Michael Gove, so far then, you're hanging on to 13. You've lost control of 6, but Norfolk, really one of the most notable ones that we need to talk about.
Yes, and I think we have to remember these are local elections. I think there were some specific local factors in Norfolk, incinerator issues and so on, which I think may have had an impact there. But it's striking that while UKIP are picking up votes, I think, across the country, 1 or 2 areas where they're doing less well, it's striking that it's UKIP that seems to be the beneficiary of the anxiety and the discontent that voters feel in the middle of a coalition government's term, and not the Labour Party. I was very struck that Labour weren't winning in Lancashire or in Cumbria, and when Michael Foot was opposition leader in 1981, these were councils that Labour took and took control of. So it's striking that Labour aren't doing as well as they did when Michael Foot was their leader.
There are Conservative supporters, formerly, who probably would quite like to vote for you, but don't feel that they can. They feel that UKIP is offering what Mr Farage earlier told us was a far clearer and a far more direct option. You don't recognise that?
Well, I think there are a host of reasons why people have chosen to vote for UKIP, and I think all of us as politicians respect the choices that individuals make, and we have to make an effort to understand what led people who in many cases might have voted Conservative in the past and might want to vote Conservative in the future, not to support us now. I think it's too simple to say that there is one explanation for UKIP's popularity. We need to respectfully analyse the range of factors.
There's a lot of emphasis on respect. Do you think it's now time for the Prime Minister to say, I apologise, they're not loonies, they're not fruitcakes, they're not closet racists?
We'll be hearing very shortly from the Prime Minister, and I wouldn't want to preempt what he's going to say.
But I think you just have. In other words, I think we're clear. I don't want to embarrass Michael.
I don't think he's going to stick to the
line. The code
line.
of these occasions, I think he may unsay some of the things that he has previously said.
Well, and he may even say UKIP.
Yes.
So, Tom Watson, what do you think so far? Labour's performance, let me be equally direct with you. Yes, you made some gains, and there'll be people celebrating in some part. It is nowhere near the level. In many areas, it's not even back to 2005. So if you're looking ahead to 2015 on the basis of these results, the fact that so many of these councillors and local workers will be, your campaign in these areas in 2015, it's not that great, is it?
We've not got all the results in yet, but of course in these areas, 80% of the areas where we were challenging returned Conservative MPs in 2010. So these really are the deepest blue heartlands that in the cycle of elections. And for me, of course, as the election coordinator, I'm looking at where the battleground seats are. So I've not seen the results for Norfolk yet, but I would imagine that we've made gains in Norwich. We've got two very strong parliamentary candidates there who are leading a renaissance in our campaigning over there. I look at the results in Hastings on the south coast, or some of those Lancashire seats that we need to win back. Cannock Chase in the Midlands in my own area. These are the building blocks of a general election victory, and we've done well in those areas despite the overall results in the shires, and that's because of the work of our members who've worked very, very hard in these elections and are genuinely up for the fight in 2015.
How disappointed are you that Northumberland has just flashed up there as still a hung council, so you've not broken through there in the way that a couple of your workers were suggesting earlier you would do?
Well, look, we need to, we wanted to win all these shire elections, even in deepest Buckingham, where we've not won an election there since 2005. We actually won a seat there, which is nice to see, and won a seat in Witney Central, which is also nice to see. So, but I mean, we have to be realistic as a party about where our strongholds are. We were very ambitious in our targets, and I think when we've had slower time to reflect on the figures, we'll be very quietly satisfied about the gains we've made in those battleground seats.
The most shocking result so far, of course, just flashed up there, Michael. The Conservatives have held on to Surrey. You'll be very glad to know. OK?
It's a reassurance.
One thing that might be slightly less reassuring is that a member of the Labour Party has just been elected in the Prime Minister's hometown of Witney.
OK.
It was almost neck and neck with a UKIPper, but the Conservatives came, I think I'm right in saying, I've just lost my notes here, third.
Maybe the Prime Minister will say something about that as well when he speaks. We never know.
May. It's interesting, just very briefly picking up Tom Watson, if I may, which is you are hearing Labour, and I think to a certain extent Liberal Democrats, sort of redefine the test. And the test is how are we doing in parliamentary constituencies? And it is clearly true that really, if you're in Labour HQ, if you work for Ed Miliband, that's what you want to know. How close are you to getting to a winning margin in the 2015 general election? But there are places like Lancashire that they have control for year after year after year, and they're still not quite, they're pretty well last night, but not quite managed to pull it off.
With Northumberland, just stop you a sec. Sorry, Tom, I'll be with you in a second, and to Lord Newby as well. I'm going to go to Mark Denton, because Mark is in Northumberland for us with the latest on the result that flashed on the screen just now. Mark, tell us more about it.
Well, since 2008, Hugh, Northumberland County Council has been with Lib Dems as the largest party, just short of an overall majority, but they've been running the council, they've been putting their policies into operation. What has happened, as you said, in the last half hour, it's been confirmed that Labour are the largest party. They're just agonisingly for them short of an overall majority, just 2 seats short of an overall majority. But what a turnaround. The Lib Dems, who are the largest party, 25 seats on this council, now reduced to 11 seats, and perhaps more importantly, reduced to the third party on the council. The Conservatives will be the official opposition with 21 seats. Swathes of Lib Dem seats lost on this council, but perhaps surprisingly in that context, the Lib Dem leader here, Jeff Reid, did survive just. He is a very relieved man today.
Mark, thanks very much for the update in Northumberland. Mark Denton there for us. Lord Newby, that clearly is quite a blow. Taking 14 seats away from your tally in Northumberland. Some other areas too not looking too healthy for you.
Well, I think it's a mixed picture for us. Northumberland's slightly unusual of the counties for the Lib Dems, because a lot of the seats in Northumberland we were facing the Labour Party. last time, we were the party that was picking up protest votes against a Labour government. Clearly, we're not picking up protest votes now, and in somewhere like those southern Northumberland seats, that's why I think we've lost there. But the key thing, I think, for us, getting back to the earlier point you made, is those seats in the county elections, which form part of our parliamentary constituencies, we've tended to do very well, and we've picked up additional seats in some of our parliamentary constituencies. Obviously, doing well in parliamentary constituencies isn't the only thing that matters to us, but it's very important as we look forward to the next general election.
We're joined from Oxford by the Conservative MP John Redwood. Mr Redwood, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Good to have you with us. What is your reading of why your party has been quite vulnerable overnight and yesterday to UKIP's campaign?
Well, I think there are a very large number of us who feel that we cannot govern the country anymore because Europe simply has far too much power. And many of us resent the way in which our government can't decide who to extradite if they're people who ought to stand trial somewhere else, can't decide the welfare benefits because the European Court of Justice thinks it knows better, can't decide our energy prices and our energy policy, cannot decide quite a lot of our criminal justice and borders policy, cannot control migration. And some of us carry on voting Conservative because we accept the Prime Minister wishes a new relationship with the European Union. But others are very impatient. They're saying, look, we want the borders sorted out now. We want energy sorted out now. We want the economic recovery now. You are not able to deliver it, any of you three big parties, because you're not renegotiating this dreadful relationship with the European Union.
Michael Gove, what's the answer to that?
To elect David Cameron with a majority at the next election and to make sure that he has the mandate and the numbers required to renegotiate our relationship with the European Union and then put that choice to the British people in a referendum.
Would that be the David Cameron, Mr Redwood, who's pushing forward with the current policies, as opposed to someone who is under pressure from some corners of the party to adjust significantly? I'm assuming you'd like him today, he's going to speak very shortly, to signal that he's listening and changing or not?
No, I want him to go further and faster on this issue. I've made no secret of that over the years, and I still do. And the fact that a lot of people agree with me, some of them have voted Conservative and some of them have voted UKIP, is just a reinforcement of that message. I'm glad that more of them still voted Conservative than UKIP, but you can now see that a lot of people are so frustrated because they know that our government ministers in many departments are simply unable now to do what they might wish to do and what the public want them to do. And it is high time we sorted out this deeply unsatisfactory relationship at a time when our partners are renegotiating to take even more power to Brussels and to do even more things that British people would object to and would find deeply damaging.
Nick?
Mr Redwood, is this the time for the Conservatives, if they can, to engineer a vote in the House of Commons on a future EU referendum, or is even that too much like kicking it into the long grass for you?
Well, we have done that once already, and not enough of our colleagues decided to vote with us. We're now looking for the Prime Minister to make a proposal. I think a majority of Conservative MPs want faster progress on the new relationship with the EU. We were very pleased with the words of the Bloomberg speech that he made not so long ago. He said in terms for the first time that this country needs a new relationship with the EU. You bet it does, and that's what Conservative and UKIP voters are trying to get across to him in these local elections. And so we're now saying to him, please, now the elections are out of the way, let's go further and faster, let's get on with it. And if the Liberal Democrats don't like it, well, they'll just have to vote against.
Well, that was the question, wasn't it? It was following, which was that, you know, there is an obvious obstacle, or at least a restriction for Mr Cameron, which is the coalition partners. I'll ask Lord Newby in a second, but you're saying that, frankly, that approach needs to be rather more brutal.
I think it's got to be modified, because I don't actually believe the Labour Party, facing the rather disappointing results they're now facing today as well, and hearing the same message with their voters going off to UKIP in some cases, will want to stand against us. I think if we had that mandate referendum now to start the renegotiation, if ministers started the renegotiation from the Conservative side, I think the Labour Party would have to go along with that.
And your thought on that, Mr Gore?
I think that the most effective way in which we can ensure that David Cameron is empowered to negotiate a better deal for Britain is to ensure that we win the next election. We're in a coalition now, and we face parliamentary arithmetic that mean that sometimes Conservatives can't get everything that they want. And therefore, I think that we need to make sure that the position at the next election is clear. And I hope that and expect that David Cameron will secure the majority necessary to make the changes that we all want to see.
It seems to me that the political difficulty the Prime Minister has is this, which is there may be people watching this programme, there may be people who voted UKIP who say the best way to harden up Tory policy is not to vote Tory, it's to vote for UKIP, because after all, he didn't make that promise till there was the prospect of UKIP doing well. Now we hear Conservatives pushing him to go even further. So there may be many Conservatives who, far from switching back to voting with the Tories, they should carry on voting for UKIP because that puts the heat where it's wanted.
But at the next general election, even UKIP's leader, Nigel Farage, concedes that he's not going to be the Prime Minister at the end of it. There's a straightforward choice. It will either be Ed Miliband or David Cameron who's going to be Prime Minister. And therefore, the choice for anyone who puts Europe at the top of their list of issues is whom would you rather have standing up for Britain in Europe? Ed Miliband, who's been weak in the face of European integration in the past, or David Cameron, who's been strong? And a related point is that, as I mentioned earlier, there are a host of reasons why people will have voted for UKIP. Of course, some of them will have been concerned about the pace and the nature of European integration, but others will have had other legitimate concerns that we do need to take into account.
We'll be hearing from UKIP in just a few minutes, actually. We'll put some of those points to them. But Mr Edward, just a final word from you on just the Prime Minister's message in the wake of these results. You mentioned further and faster, but again, just spell it out in policy terms and in terms of promises as you approach the next, well, not just the next election, the next European elections next year, which are equally relevant. What do you want?
Well, I want the Prime Minister to say in terms that he does want future ministers to have the power to settle our borders, to decide our immigration policy, to decide our welfare policy, to decide all our tax policies, to decide our energy policy, and that our current relationship with Europe prevents all of those things. And I hope he will say to all those people who voted UKIP that he wants them as part of his coalition, part of his army, because we need to unite to fight the European Union, and we need to unite to fight the federalist parties. And so David Cameron, I hope, will now be reaching out to all those voters who feel very strongly that the things they want on immigration, on tax, on benefits, on the kind of country they want to live in, are being thwarted by the European Union.
Mr Redwood, again, thanks for joining us. John Redwood there for us in our studio in Oxford. 24 councils declared, 11 to come. We talked a little bit about UKIP there. We've talked a bit about the Conservatives. We'll come back to Labour in a moment. I want to think about the Lib Dems for a second because we haven't discussed their particular case for a while. Let's rejoin Jeremy, who's going to take us through some of the Lib Dem performance.
Hugh, yes, just have a look at the map first of all, because you can see it's getting busier now, isn't it? We're seeing the blue that we started with being washed away, and we have, of course, Derbyshire there in red for Labour, and Warwickshire no overall control, Gloucestershire no overall control, and then Norfolk, which you put up in lights, no overall control from Conservative. Quite a stunning result there. But we're looking at the Liberal Democrats, and listening to the conversation in the studio through the programme, it's apparent that the Lib Dems' defence of their performance is to say they haven't dropped that many seats so far. So let's just see if there's some truth in that. If I put up, just on the graphics behind us here, let me show you, if I can, the change in key wards on 2009. So we're talking here about percentages. We're looking at the drop for the coalition parties, particularly here. And, of course, you can see that the Conservatives are down 9%. You'll be discussing that. This amazing rise for UKIP, up 17% here. There we go. And then Labour up 8%, and then the Liberal Democrats down 11%. So in terms of the coalition partners here, the Conservatives getting punished a little bit less than the Liberal Democrats, down 11. Greens down 1, others -4. So when you look at the share, it doesn't look very good for the Liberal Democrats. But there is a line of defence for them, and it's this. If you look at the number of seats they've lost, it's a slightly different story. So come around with me again, and we'll have a look here. So you can see, this is just, obviously, these don't come in any necessarily logical way, but Conservatives down 173. That'll change as we go through the day. Labour up 149, and the Lib Dems down -60. So far fewer Lib Dem seats shed so far than Conservative, even though their drop in terms of their percentage of the vote is greater. What's the reason for that? Let's have a look at these Lib Dem seats and just focus on the political makeup, how the parties are arranged in them. This is what you see. If you look at the Lib Dems, you see one thing absolutely clearly, which is this. In nearly all of their seats, 80%, the Conservatives are in second place in those Lib Dem seats. So what's happened here is that in lots of Lib Dem seats, the Lib Dems have been weakened, they've been vulnerable, but nearly all times it's a Conservative who's challenged. And these coalition partners are both hurting in this election. So the Conservatives are putting up a less effective challenge, and in some cases the Lib Dems are not losing the seat. And that's why they're able to say, well, yeah, sure, the percentage has gone down, but actually so far our count of seats is looking more robust than you might expect.
Jeremy, thanks very much. Jeremy, there on the Lib Dems in this case. Nick, any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think what it tells us is this, that those people, and they've been saying it ever since the coalition was formed, those people who say, the Lib Dems, they'll get wiped out as a result of this, it's palpably not the case. They're not going to be wiped out in local government, and they're not going to be wiped out in Westminster. What we're learning is that they can hold on to members of Parliament and to councillors with far fewer votes in the country as a whole. Now, that has implications, though, because if they are seen as the fourth party of British politics rather than third, at least in terms of vote share, UKIP will compete for attention with them. They will compete for the claim to be a national party as well. But I think it depends whether you think the glass is half full or half empty. If you dreamed as a Liberal Democrat of them becoming the force in British politics, which would, say, replace the Labour Party on the centre-left, it ain't going to happen, not at the moment anyway. If, on the other hand, you had a nightmare as a Liberal Democrat that this is all over, going to government would destroy it, it's pretty clear it isn't going to destroy them.
Dick, maybe thoughts on that?
Well, it clearly isn't going to destroy us, and I think most Liberal Democrats are natural optimists. When I look at the UKIP vote share, I remember a huge number of votes that the SDP and the Alliance racked up, and won us virtually no seats. British politics is a very, very cruel business, and the key question when it comes particularly to Westminster is, can you have concentration of votes that enable you to win seats? And I think on the basis of these results, we're pretty confident that we'll be doing reasonably well compared to where we start off in terms of seats at the next election.
OK.
Result in first past the post, I would have thought now, the Liberal Democrats. It would be a disaster if you had proportional representation.
No, it would not. It would mean that we would have a lot more seats, but not quite as many more as we would otherwise have.
OK, we just had a result in from the Isle of Wight. Emily?
Yeah, let's just have a look at that, because it's quite a strange one. It's been taken out of Conservative overall control into no overall control. That's the grey slate here. But look at the arrangements of the parties. The Independents are the largest party. We don't know if that's one group of Independents or if they're different people who may have to work together. The Conservatives then in second place on 15. UKIP have picked up 2 seats here. They fielded 29 candidates and they have picked up 2. Labour on 2. Let's look at what happened overnight and you can get a sense of that. So these 10 independents, and I'm sure we'll get more when we go down there locally and find out a little bit who they are, have picked up 10 seats at the expense of the Conservative, who've fallen 9. UKIP then on 2, Labour on 1, and the Lib Dems have also taken quite a hit. That's strange because don't forget that this was a part of the world where the Lib Dems really used to dominate. Not so long ago, they had 70% of the councillors in the Isle of Wight. So that one's just come in and probably needs a bit more unpicking.
Emily, thanks very much. Michael Gove, what do you think of that, the Isle of Wight? I know there are particular circumstances there, but what's your take?
I don't know the Isle of Wight in the detail that that beautiful part of England deserves, so I don't know what the independents who've won have as their principal issue. I suspect that there are factors there.
It's not great either for the Lib Dems, is it? Because you've been traditionally very strong on the Isle of Wight.
We have. I think the independents are an unusual force in the Isle of Wight and have clearly done very well against us. But it's like all islands, it's a very particular ecology.
Nick, just we'll be talking in just a minute to Adam Afriye, who is the Conservative MP, who may have a different perspective to Mr Gove. Who knows? We'll find out. But just at this stage, what are we now looking out for with 10 to go? Just basically moving towards people making rather firmer conclusions that we were making this morning, because, you know, we're well over halfway now. Are we fairly certain that we're saying the Lib Dem performance has been what? Disappointing?
Well, yes, disappointing, but again, it's a glass half full or glass half empty question. Certainly disappointing. You don't want, if you're the Lib Dems, for the pain to carry on, and the pain does go on. They're losing, not winning, but they're not losing at the same speed they were last year or the year before, for example. For Labour, I think the news this afternoon looks quite a lot rosier than it did overnight. In other words, the results we were just talking about in Nottinghamshire, for example, or in Lancashire, they're not there. I'm sure Tom Watson and others would say, another push, we're almost there. They're not there. These are places they did better. For example, in 2005, when their vote share wasn't very high, in truth. Tony Blair, post the Iraq War, struggled to win that general election. They're still not matching that performance. On the other hand, you can say, well, look, it was terrible under Gordon Brown, and they've taken some pretty big strides in those areas. But they will worry about the Essexes, the Lincolnshires, parts of the country where we're seeing a drop in the Labour vote. So there's a mixed message there too.
Actually not. In Essex and Lincolnshire, yes, we've not won the county, but we've done very well in the battleground seat of Harlow. And in Lincolnshire, we've done very well in Lincoln, that we need to win back at the Westminster election. So I think you need to go below the surface to see where these results, what these results matter for Westminster. And when you said we've reset the test, actually the test we set ourselves was 200 gains and progress in the 45 battleground seats. I've not seen all the figures yet, but I would hope that we can make progress in most of those seats.
OK, let's bring Mr Afriyie, Adam Afriyie, who's joining us now. And good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Good to have you with us. Well, you've been critical in some ways of the way that the Cameron government has run, not least in terms of, I think the recent thing was jobs and appointments, wasn't it? Does that kind of thing impact on performance at elections like this?
I've been wholly supportive of the Conservative government and their role they're playing in coalition. What I've been looking at is the future of our country and the future nature of government, because government's just too big. But overall today, my feeling is just this feeling of sadness. It's deep sadness because we've lost councillors and the activists have been working hard. But more than that, for the British people now, we're going to have perhaps Labour-run councils, councils with no overall control, and that means their council tax will go up and their services will go down.
Why has your party been so vulnerable in many areas to the UKIP appeal?
Well, look, there is no getting away from this. You can't spin it. There's nothing to be said other than people are just fed up with the political class. And I have to say, so am I to a certain degree. There's a Westminster bubble. Everything sounds and feels the same. And people don't necessarily feel that what's said is credible. And that's why I think certainly in government, in coalition government, we need to take action as Conservatives so that people go, actually, they didn't just say that, they did it.
What is David Cameron saying that is not credible?
Well, I don't think this is about David Cameron. This is like a plague on all our houses, if you like. And I can see look, if you look at Italy, people were so fed up, so desperate that they voted for a comedian, a third of the vote. So here in the UK, it's not surprising that right now, that when the political class is not connected with the public, that we're going to be suffering in this way. But it's not the Conservative Party, it's not the Conservative politicians who are going to be suffering. It's the British people, because without a Conservative government, a wholly Conservative government, we're not going to get the kind of Britain that we want.
I'm not clear what that means in terms of policy and changes. What practically are we talking about?
Well, look, we've got some great immigration policies. We've got a brilliant position on the European Union, which says that we're going to renegotiate and then give the people a say. But even when we say those things, even when they're said, people think, whatever. I've been on the grounds in South Shields and Oxford East and other places around the country, and people just don't really believe what the political elite are saying. So I think we have to reconnect. In some ways, you've got to get rid of some of the spin doctors and just talk to people directly.
Does that make sense, Michael Gove?
I think Adam is right to say that the Conservative position on immigration and keeping control is effective. We've managed to reduce net migration by a third. I think he's also right that David Cameron's been effective on the European stage as well. And I think there's a third point that Adam makes, which is well made, which is that there is a sense sometimes of exasperation with the political classes. We do sometimes see, the three of us, sort of, pasteurised cheese on the cheese board, and then, UKIP is the rich, ripe, stinky alternative, and people think, oh, don't mind having a slice of that, So I can understand that, yes.
Yeah, it's the stinky that may bother people. I mean, that's almost in the realm. Yeah,
that's sometimes how I like my cheese, even though it's not necessarily good for my waistline. I think the thing is that Nigel Farage is a very effective and charismatic figure, and he can effectively articulate the anxieties that people feel and their exasperation with the political class. So in that sense, I think Adam's analysis has a lot of merit.
Let's bring in Jeff Driver, who's the former leader of Lancashire Council, who's joining us now. Mr. Driver, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you. I'm still the leader of the County Council, not the former leader of the County Council.
Well, that's a very important correction, which I'm very happy to go along with. So tell us what happened then in that election. How did you do? How did your party fare?
Well, we've lost overall control, but no party has overall control.
And why did that happen?
Because the voters in Lancashire voted more for other parties than my party.
Yes, thank you very much for pointing that out to us. I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts on why that might have happened.
Well, I've answered the question, and there can't be any more straightforward answer than that. I'm not really sure what you're trying to get me to say, Hugh.
Well, I'm not trying to get you to say anything. I'm trying to... you're the expert in your local area. Why were people not voting for you this time who were voting for you before? What are they telling you? You've been out campaigning, I'm assuming.
Well, that's a different question from the one you asked at first. I can answer that question. Clearly, we fought a campaign on our local record as to what we've achieved through the last 4 years. But I suspect that many voters in Lancashire have looked wider than what's been happening in Lancashire when they decided how they wanted to vote.
Right, well, that gets us into an interesting area. So, again, if I can ask the question in a different way, what are the factors which were unhelpful to you in this election?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question. You need to ask people who voted as to why they voted the way they did. I can only tell you what we campaigned on and what the result was.
OK, Jeff Driver, thank you very much, and happy to talk to you as leader of Lancashire Council. Thank you very much indeed. Jeff Driver there. Do we have some more results in? Yes, I think we do. Emily?
We do. This is what we're seeing. If I can just show you the gains and losses, it's probably the best way to do it. The ones that have just slipped in here are Oxfordshire, which has gone into no overall control from the Conservatives. We also understand that West Sussex has got some interesting results, and that has been held. If I just show you that, we can't go into the full result of Oxfordshire yet. As soon as we can, I'll show it to you. But for now, let me bring you this one. Updated then to 2013. They are still counting, which is why we carry on with the count so far, but we know that it has been safely held by the Conservatives. They needed 36. They're on 46. This is the figure that jumps out at you, though, isn't it? UKIP have gained 10 seats here. They fielded 71 candidates, and that is a big result for them. They didn't have any representation here last time round. Lib Dem on 8, Labour on 6. Let me just show you what happened there today. The Conservatives down 2, but this was a place where the coalition partners were really fighting it out in a battle, and the Lib Dems have come off considerably worse. As you can see, there are quite a big hit there for the Lib Dems, down 13 councillors. Labour making some gains. They lost 5 last time round. And I'm also going to show you the share. Now, remember, of course, we're a first-past-the-post system, so this doesn't have as much resonance in seats. But look at that. UKIP sitting in second place, pushing the Lib Dems and Labour, both, I think you could say, into third place. But they've got 29% share of the vote. That is quite a dramatic result for UKIP in a part of the world they haven't previously been.
Emily, thanks very much. We've talked a lot about the UKIP surge today. We should talk as well about a party who in the past have been in the position where they've been threatening lots of the others, and indeed they've picked up 1 or 2 seats as well. I'm talking about the Greens, of course. And Natalie Bennett, the leader of the Greens, became leader last year, Natalie. I think that's right, isn't it?
About 6 months ago, yes.
Thank you very much for coming in and for waiting patiently.
Thank you.
Well, tell us, how have you done?
We've had a really very good day. My count is a net gain of 11 seats. We've won our first 2 seats in Warwickshire. We've won for the first time 2 seats in Worcestershire, 2 seats on Essex County Council, the first time we've been represented there. We've got our first seat in Kent. We've doubled our representation on Bristol Council, and I believe I've just heard early word that we've got our first seat on Surrey County Council. So our aim in these elections was really to spread around the country, to reach out beyond our heartland areas like Brighton, Pavilion, where we hold of course, the parliamentary seat, Oxford, Norwich, our traditional strongholds, to spread around the country, and that's what we've done.
So for viewers watching, wondering whether you've actually achieved your goals and whether you've performed according to your expectations, what would you say to them?
You could actually look at the tape of me on the Daily Politics a few days ago saying that I was expecting gains of roundabout double figures. So I think gains of 11 is definitely matching up to what we expected.
What happened in Norfolk where you lost 3 seats?
Well, I think what we've seen in Norfolk, I haven't had a chance to have a look at the detail of the results, but we've seen a very, very varied picture in different parts of Norfolk, different things happening in different places. I think our opposition to the incinerator there won a strong support, but some other issues locally may have arisen as well.
What result are you most proud of overnight?
Oh, I think I'd have to put the West Midlands together. 2 years ago, we had 3 councillors on 3 councils in the West Midlands. I think if I've got my numbers right, we're now up to 19 on 7. It's 19 councillors on 7 councils, and that's very much a growth area for us.
There was a time, I mean, I'm old enough to go back to 1989, when there was talk then of the Greens really becoming a major force in politics in Britain in terms of representation. And in '89, in the Euro elections, there was certainly a surge then. It's not quite happened since then. Are we looking, now that UKIP are on the march, is that chance for you to step in there as the party that can answer people's problems, has that chance disappeared?
Very much not. I think what we're seeing is a breakup of the traditional 2 or 3 party system in Britain. Fewer and fewer people regard themselves as a lifetime Tory or a lifetime Labour or a lifetime Lib Dem, if there's any still around, voters. People are really looking at the policies, looking at the ideas and voting that way. And of course that's very much going to throw into question our first past the post electoral system.
That's another topic altogether, Natalie. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Natalie Bennett there. And with me in the studio is Diane James, who stood for UKIP in Eastleigh. Well, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming in. Well, you've been celebrating?
Phenomenal result, I think, is the words that we're using within the party. There's a lot of people out there very tired, quite clearly, and I'm sure that applies to the other party activists as well. But at the moment, it's just positive after positive.
Conservatives losing Cambridgeshire, so I'll ask Emily about that in a second, because that's another significant result that's just come in. One of the issues today, which Mr Farage was discussing earlier with us, is to do with credibility and policy, and the fact that people are possibly now, after this result, going to be even more keen to take a magnifying glass to some of the things that you're talking about. We were talking about immigration policy earlier. Are you really in a position, are you ready to be offering the kind of comprehensive policy platform that can withstand the kind of scrutiny that these parties are very used to?
Yes, well, first of all, it's going to be a two-way street, obviously. I mean, we've been subjected to a huge amount of scrutiny over the last few weeks, along with all the insults and such. But we have been the only party to issue a fresh national manifesto, and that obviously is in development, and we're happy to keep looking at that. All of our candidates then were able to use that national manifesto and translate it into a very local one for them, and the results speak for themselves. That's why, you know, the candidates out there have been able to win on a local basis.
Mr Gould, why is your party saying that Diane's party has a £120 billion black hole in the plans? That's the figure you've been using.
Well, as Diane has pointed out, there's increased scrutiny of UKIP's policy platform. And I think that UKIP have been saying, among other things, that they want to increase spending on defence and yet at the same time also lower taxation. And an initial scrutiny of the UKIP proposition is that it didn't add up. But of course, as Diane says, when we come to the election, UKIP will have its policy platform refined, and they will come under greater scrutiny, and we'll debate with Diane, as we do with Tom and Dick, in a civilised fashion as we seek to ensure that there is proper scrutiny of the offer.
We're going to pause there for a second, because it's an important moment for us where we imagine that these elections have been taking place in all areas, because that'll really give us a sense of where these shares are. So let's join Jeremy Vine straight away.
Hugh, yes, a big moment now where we are ready with the map looking a lot busier than it did a few hours ago to give you what we call our projected national share. This is the share we believe the parties would have got had this local election in certain areas been spread out across the whole of the country. So this is what we believe the parties would have got in the BBC's projected national share. And here you see the percentages. 29% for the Labour Party. That's you have to go back really to a period, 1979, 1997, period of Labour opposition to see them scoring around there. But even then, they often weren't that low. The Conservatives on 25%. That's the worst ever Conservative share in a local election since we started doing projected national share, which was 1982. We've talked a lot about UKIP. This is their first time, by the way, they've had a column in this projected national share showing here. So the purple column is a first, 23%. You've talked about how sensational that is. And then here we have the Liberal Democrats on 14%. And this showing for the Liberal Democrats, notwithstanding the reasons we discussed why they've held on to some of their council seats where they were threatened, this showing of 14% is the worst Liberal Democrat showing ever in a local election. So those are the percentages as if this election were to be held across the whole country. 29% for Labour, poor. 25% for the Conservatives. Again, we're into record low territory here. 23% for UKIP, a stunning arrival in the top 4 for them, and pushed into 4th place, 14% for the Liberal Democrats. And you'll notice one thing straight away. Have we ever had? We can't remember a time when the 3 main parties were pushed, all of them, below 30% in a local election. I'll give you some history going back to the mid-2000s, just so we get a sense of how this fits in to previous local election performances. And, of course, the first thing you notice, we now have UKIP out of this because, of course, they don't really have a backstory in these local elections, so it's not possible to do a line graph for them. So we're just with the Conservatives, Labour and the Lib Dems. And here we go. So 2006, Labour had just won their 3rd landslide. Or their 3rd election. It wasn't a landslide, that one. Conservatives, 36%. This is in local elections. Lib Dems, 10% behind, and Labour already starting to show a lot of the kind of attrition that you get in local government if you've won 3 elections, 24%. And then we go to the year these county seats and council seats were last fought, 2009. Very significant because Gordon Brown scored only 20% in those elections, and the Conservatives led on 35%. So this is the comparison year for the purposes of these council elections. And let's just follow the sequence here, because you see under Ed Miliband this recovery starting for Labour, and you can see there 38%, 31%, Labour with a substantial, relatively substantial lead over the Conservatives, and the Liberal Democrats already starting to grind away a bit down the bottom because, presumably, of the fallout from coalition government. Now just watch the extraordinary effect on this graph when I input the results from these local elections and see what happens. And you see all the main parties driven there below 30%. Labour's still leading, they will cling to that, but only by 4% over the Conservatives. And the Lib Dems really having, as I mentioned earlier, a very, very poor night and day, driven lower than they ever have been as the Liberal Democrats. So we'll untangle as the hours go on, the days go on, work out just exactly how much voters have been taken from which parties by UKIP. But this extraordinary election has seen the pattern of the poll change here. Labour still in the lead, not by much, and all the main parties below 30.
Jeremy, that is indeed fascinating, and I'm going to bring in Professor John Curtis straight away, who's been crunching the numbers all day for us to come up with this. And John, first of all, would you, Jeremy, they're stressing what a startling range of figures there is, and obviously within the context of UKIP's performance. But by the way, Staffordshire just come in with Conservatives holding on to that. That's interesting too. We'll come back to that. But John, just talk us through the. That's remarkable. We will come to it. Yeah. But John, first of all, your thoughts on that share.
Well, I think in a sense this just underlined the story we've been telling ever since about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. That is, UKIP are putting in a remarkable performance. And inevitably, given that UKIP are indeed in our projected national share at around 23%, it was going to be very difficult for any party to pass the 30% mark. I mean, the fascinating question now is, will this prove to be a blip, an exception, or do we now have to accept that the days of two-party politics in Britain, which arguably we're already beginning to look a bit thin now that we have a coalition in charge at Westminster rather than a single-party government, do we now have to begin to accept that those days are over, and that we are now looking at a very different kind of politics for the future of Britain than we saw in the past? Now, I think, as Nick has been repeatedly emphasising, we don't know the answer to that question yet, but we are now very clear that it is an absolutely central question to be asked about what happens in the weeks and months ahead.
Nick Robinson is also with us. Nick, what's your take?
Well, it does confirm that this, at least, is four-party politics. As John Curtis is saying, what we know is we're very likely to get four-party politics in a year's time when the European elections happen. After all, UKIP have done impressively, though not as impressively as today in the past. We simply don't know, though, whether that will feed through to a general election. Clearly, the system makes that very hard for UKIP. In a sense, much as the Liberal Party of old used to be, much as the SDP were in the 1980s, much as the Liberal Democrats have been over the years, if you spread your support thin, as UKIP are doing, roughly evenly right across the country. You can get hundreds, thousands of votes and still get no seats at all in a Westminster election. But what this result will signal is a desperate search from all the political leaders of the main established parties for the formula that reconnects with those people, reconnects with the UKIP supporters who have given them all one or other form of bloody nose.
Here in the studio, Lord Newby, I'm going to start at the bottom of that table. 14%, and Jeremy really just underlined for us how dire that was. Do you accept the figure?
Absolutely accept the figure. No, that is the figure. It's absolutely clear what's happened to our vote. It's happened since we went into government. We stopped being the party of protest. That's what's been reflected in the national polls. That's what's reflected here.
So what are the options for you? What can you do about that?
Well, what we're doing is that we are digging in where we've got MPs, where we've got councillors working very hard. What we're going to be doing as we get towards the general election is working very hard to explain what we've been able to achieve in government, raising the tax threshold, pupil premium, a whole raft of things that have happened to benefit ordinary people because the Lib Dems are in government. That's the job of all politicians, to explain what their policies are, why they might be effective and why we think we have been effective. But, you know, we got a vast number of votes as Liberal Democrats from people who were fed up with Tony Blair about the Iraq War. We got people who were fed up with Gordon Brown because they thought he was lacklustre. Now, those are reasons which have gone, and we've got to make our case as a party of government, and we're in the process of doing it. And it was inevitably going to take time and be hard going.
And you've just got a couple of years to make the case in a rather better way.
Absolutely. And I think we're absolutely focused on that. But it will be on the basis, as I say, of specific things that we can say to people, we have achieved. This would not have happened without the Liberal Democrats. If you vote for us next time, you get more of that.
Tom, 29% on that projected national share. Again, just underlining what I said to you earlier on, which was that, you know, you're not at the kind of level, anything near it, where, you know, you can look with confidence to 2015.
Yeah, look, I mean, you know, let's take success when we can bank it. We've got the highest national share, and there was a discussion among some of the academics before we got to polling day about whether this set of elections would give us that projection. But we've got to accept, you know, as soon as there are four parties in, then everybody's share is going to go down. And I'm not sure if that is a useful tool of projecting what will happen in the future. Certainly, I would imagine the results of the general election will be significantly different to that.
You know,
but it's an interesting metric.
It's a snapshot,
for the
you know, and it's not a forecast or a prediction. Well, let's underline that. Michael Gove, 25% on that projected share. What does that tell you?
Well, it's an interesting arithmetical exercise, these projected national vote shares, and it gives John Curtis and lots of, you know, clever professors a chance to, you know, speculate. But the surprising thing is, you know, I agree with Tom. We just look at the results on the ground. Just before we had this discussion about some, you know, future projections, we had a real result from Staffordshire. Earlier this week, I went to Newcastle-under-Lyme, so did Ed Miliband. It was going to be the battleground area that Labour were expecting to win, and the Conservatives have held it with seats still to declare. The truth is that it's the Conservatives, and indeed the coalition parties, actually, I mean, I think Dick got a good point, have been surprisingly resilient, and there's been no move towards Labour. I mentioned, you know, just after 2 o'clock, Michael Foot. When he was the leader of the opposition in 1981, Labour won Staffordshire, they won Cumbria, they won Lancashire. They're not winning them now. Now, if people are voting UKIP because they express a sense of exasperation with the government, I can understand that. But what is really striking is that no one's voting for Labour in anything like the numbers they need to have in order to be on course for government.
Well,
and Tom is a doughty fighter, and he'll put a very good spin on it, I'm sure. But he must be disappointed.
No, Michael, now we're into the spin. In 1981, when Michael Foot was leader, we'd not had the local government reforms that took unitary authorities out of counties. So you must know that that's a bogus comparison to make, and that your spin doctors have given you that. And then in Staffordshire, we knew that it would be hard going for us to win Staffordshire. We wanted to win it, but it would be hard going. But if you drill down into those figures again, look at Cannock, where there is an 11% swing from the Conservatives to Labour that would deliver a Labour MP 2015. So Newcastle under Lyme already has a Labour MP, Michael, so let's hope that it's not going to go
Yes,
to
I know,
Somerset.
but on this record, he's a very nice guy, Paul Farrelly. On this performance, I'm afraid he's not going to be a Labour MP at the next election.
If the
Conservatives are doing so well in Staffordshire, I mean,
well, if you're banking on defeating Paul Farrelly at the next election, you need another argument.
And this, Dan, is what you've caused.
Lovely
yes?
guy, but
this is the chaos you caused.
You saddled with the wrong leader.
If I can just override the gentleman there, look at that UKIP result, 23%. I came in with just short of 28% in Eastleigh. South Shields last night, just short of 24%. Corby, 22%. There you are. You know, we're doing very, very well, and that is just reflecting what will happen in 2015. And Nigel made a very, very good point, which is we have yet to fight a true marginal. And when that happens, that sort of result, and if we take the result we've had from the local council elections, that really does give us a chance. No one's saying that UKIP is necessarily going to field the next full government, but what we are is now a very, very major player.
We're going to pause. Michael?
I was just going to ask Diane one question.
No,
who do you think would be a better Prime Minister standing up for Britain in Europe, David Cameron or Ed Miliband? Because, as you've acknowledged, that is the choice at the next election.
Well, neither, Michael, unfortunately.
But
Absolutely
you've got to
neither.
choose one of the two.
No, I don't agree. No.
But now you're behaving like one of the sort of politicians that folk don't like, because, you know, one of the great things about Nigel is he always gives a straight answer to a straight question.
Yes.
It's a straight question.
He said he'd
who
rather
would be
have you,
better?
Michael.
And
He
the
said he'd
answer is
rather have
neither.
you.
Neither is the answer. We're going to take a pause. We're going to take a break. If you're watching on BBC Two, we'll be back at 5 o'clock, but the coverage continues on the BBC News channel throughout the afternoon. We've got 7 results to come, so not all counted yet. So join us then, and thanks for watching.
Mobiles at the ready take on Eggheads in an hour at 6 with Dermot Monaghan hosting after Vote 2013 here on BBC Two.
Well, hello, very good evening. It's 5 o'clock and welcome back to the BBC's Election Centre. We've had nearly all the results in. We've had 32 councils declared with just 3 to go. It's the biggest electoral test of the year, no question. And the biggest smiles have been in the UKIP camp, for obvious reasons, given the gains they've enjoyed. Their leader, Nigel Farage, has been celebrating quite a big surge in UKIP support. Over 130 new councillors at the last count. And he said his party will be changing the face of British politics. That's the claim, anyway. UKIP's surge has been largely at the expense of the Conservatives. They've lost over 300 councillors, and they failed to retain control of some 10 councils, but they have held on to 17 other councillors, so it's by all means not all bad news for them. David Cameron has said today that he'll be working hard to win voters back after this result. Day started very well for Labour, with a win in the South Shields parliamentary by-election, and they've had other successes in council elections in Darbishire. But like everyone else, they too have been hit by UKIP's surge in popularity. They're up, but the experts say perhaps by less than they'd hoped. Well, now it seems a good moment for us to have a look at the counts that are still going on, because believe it or not, even at this late stage in the day, there are still things which are unresolved. And one of them is the one election that's taking place outside England, and that is Ynys-Môn, or Angle C in North Wales, where there's an election taking place there for very special reasons, because they've been in special measures. They've been run by basically commissioners sent up from government in Cardiff. Why? Because that council has been in a mess, and there's been lots of infighting and a bit of gridlock. So they're having this election, should have been last year, the election taking place this year, and that is still not fully done. So we'll be keeping tabs on Angle C. Also still going on, well, although actually they do look as if their business is done in Doncaster, don't they? But that is the second of the mayoral contest that we were talking about. We've already had North Tyneside that declared overnight, but Doncaster there, they seem to be taking a break, and I think their work is probably done. So hopefully, fingers crossed, after 8 hours, I think, of counting in Doncaster, after the second round runoff between the Labour candidate and the incumbent Mayor Peter Davies standing as an independent. We may get a result in that Doncaster mayoral contest, so stay with us for that. With me, we've had a bit of a change in the studio again. Nick Robinson is back with us. Good to have you with us, Nick. Chris Grayling has joined us for the Conservatives. Chucker's still with us for Labour. And we have Ed Davey for the Lib Dems. Thank you very, very much for coming in. Yeah. We'll be with you in a second. OK, that's my promise. We'll be back in a second because we want a quick update of the news with Jane.
Thanks, Hugh. Good afternoon again. David Cameron says the Conservatives must show respect for voters backing UKIP, whose members he once dismissed as fruitcakes. The UK Independence Party has enjoyed unprecedented success in local elections, gaining more than 130 seats so far. That mainly at the expense of the Tories, who were down about 320 and were pushed into third place in the South Shields parliamentary by-election. The latest details come from our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
They still don't control a single council, yet UKIP were popping the corks, and this is why. Local authorities can't bring Britain out of the EU, so with around a quarter of the vote in the seats where they've been standing and more than 100 councillors, they say this is proof that they've broadened their appeal.
We've been abused by everybody, the entire establishment, and now they're shocked and stunned that we're getting over 25% of the vote everywhere we stand across the country. This is a real sea change in British politics.
The party the Prime Minister once described as closet racists, fruitcakes and nutters is now the official opposition in Lincolnshire and in Norfolk. Today, David Cameron's tone towards UKIP was less hostile.
It's no good insulting a political party that people have chosen to vote for. Of course they should be subject, and they will be subject to proper scrutiny of their policies and their plans, but we need to show respect for people who've taken the choice to support this party, and we're going to work really hard to win them back.
The Conservatives were braced for big losses at these elections, but given a strict choice, they'd rather lose out to UKIP than Labour.
12,000.
Ed Miliband's party easily held the parliamentary seat of South Shields and won the mayoral contest in nearby North Tyneside. But despite some victories in less traditional territory too, Labour weren't performing as well in the county council elections as they did in 2005, when they last won a general election. The Labour leader was in Hastings today to show his willingness to take the electoral battle to the south.
I also recognise, having gone round the country during this campaign, the vote for UKIP, the two-thirds of people who didn't vote, that there are still lots of people saying, can anyone turn this country round? I believe Labour can.
The Lib Dems' share of the vote fell in these elections, but the leader sees UKIP as a passing party of protest.
People might be attracted to the simple answers that the UK Independence Party is offering to deal with this country's complex problems. But I don't think they do have the answers to the dilemmas we face as a country. I believe that the Liberal Democrats do.
UKIP were described recently by senior Conservatives as clowns, but tonight the leader, Nigel Farage, was able to celebrate being taken more seriously all round. Ian Watson, BBC News, Westminster.
In other news, the jury in the trial of Mark Bridger, who's accused of murdering April Jones, has heard a statement from the 5-year-old's mother. Coral Jones said she initially didn't let her daughter play outside on the night she went missing, but she relented after April had a little tantrum. Mark Bridger denies abduction and murder. Our correspondent John Brain is following the case at Mould Crown Court. Bring us up to date, John, with everything that the jury has heard and seen today.
Well, Jane, the raw emotion of the statement from April's mother really came through, even though it was just words read out by a lawyer. She spoke of her panic when April disappeared, how she searched everywhere, even looked in the bins. The jury were also shown CCTV footage. We can show you some of that now. This is an image of April taken from the leisure centre just less than 2 hours before she disappeared. It's the last image, or one of the last images ever recorded of her. The jury were also shown some footage of Mark Bridger the day after April had disappeared, walking his dog. This is taken from a police helicopter. The prosecution say it's strange that he didn't look up at that helicopter when everyone in the town was looking for April. He seemed to have other matters on his mind, they say. Well, this case will resume on Tuesday with evidence from the child that was playing with April when she was allegedly abducted. Jane.
John, thank you. John Brain. The Royal Bank of Scotland returned to profit in the first quarter of this year. RBS, which is more than 80% owned by the taxpayer, made a pre-tax profit of £826 million. That compares to a loss of £1.5 billion in the same period last year. The chairman of RBS, Sir Philip Hampton, says the bank should be ready for a return to the private sector by the middle of 2014. And those are some of the main stories here today. Right now, let's return to the team at Westminster for all the latest on the local election results.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, and welcome back to our election studio here at Westminster, where we've been monitoring these events coming in all day. Some of them, of course, took place overnight. We were discussing them this morning, but we've had a big flood of results now this afternoon. We've got 3 to come in, and at this point, I'm going to ask Nick Robinson really for his take on where we are. What would you say, Nick?
What has changed, I think, as a result of these elections is how most people will now look at UKIP. Before today, there were plenty of people who said, look, it's a pressure group, it's not a political party. It is now putting down roots in communities throughout England, not the UK. We're largely getting elections in England today. They said it was merely a temporary home for disgruntled Tories. We know that they are winning votes, not just from ex-Tories, but from Labour and Liberal Democrats too. And they said they only matter in European elections. Well, this is a local election, and they sure as hell matter today. What we don't know, of course, is how durable it is. Nobody can possibly know that. But we now know that the gentlemen who are in front of us, who represent the 3 big established Westminster parties, are now having to think about what life in a 4-party world electorally might mean. And I think you'll see instant reactions from all of them. The Prime Minister with the Queen's speech next week will react in terms of what he's saying. The focus, I'm told, will be immigration. I think the Labour Party will focus on how they reconnect. The Liberal Democrats too will have to angst away about how they reconnect with the sort of protest voters they once naturally got.
Interesting. We'll discuss that in a second with our guests, but I think it's a good moment for Emily to take us through what we've had and what we're still waiting for, Emily.
Yeah, we've still got 2 councils to hear from, but if you've just joined us, let me show you the scoreboard picture of the day so far. Most of these are comfortable Conservative areas of the country, the south, the southwest, so it's not surprising to see that most of the councillors remain Conservative, 1,076, but here are the losses. They've taken a hit of 320 tonight. Labour pushing forward then in second place with 433. They've made gains of 260. Some will say that's not the gains that they were really looking for. They failed to take back a couple of key targets they would have liked to see. The Lib Dems, don't forget, now a party of government with the Conservatives on 338. They've taken a hit too tonight. Maybe not as bad as the one they took at local level last year, but they've still taken losses of 106. UKIP, the big story of the night, as we've seen, now sitting on 144. That's probably 3 times what they imagined at one stage that they could ever take here. Gains of 136. A good night for the Greens, who've added on more modest gains, but still on 22. And in others, I can just show you briefly, you'll see some of the residents and so on. The BNP have lost the 3 seats that they held in 2009. What does that mean for councils themselves? The Conservatives sitting on 17, but they have lost 10. They have lost control of 10 councils tonight. 2 of those have gone Labour and 8 of those have gone into no overall control. So let's just have a look at those gains and losses. Just losses for the Conservatives. Norfolk, Lancashire, Lincolnshire, Oxfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Gloucestershire and Warwickshire, all into no overall control. This is the one council that the Labour Party have taken from the Conservatives. And let me just show you that as gains. Again, Nottinghamshire, Darbishire, places that Labour really expected and wanted to take back tonight. There's a couple of others still to come in. But perhaps the story of the night is best exemplified if I show you this one, which just compares a few of the results, different parts of the country, and you can see here the kind of inroads that the UKIP party is making in terms of that share. The change in share, UKIP up 24%, up 21% in Lincolnshire, and in Kent, 20% as well. They gained 17 seats in Kent. They gained 16 in Lincolnshire. Let's just go in and have a look, see what that's done to the political landscape of this council. It's pushed it into no overall control. It's taken the Tories into that little slip of blue that tells us the Conservative Party no longer control it. And here you go then. They're the largest party, but you can really start to see the way that UKIP vote is eating into what might have been Labour gains or what might have been at least a Conservative hold. If I show you that as the percentage again, you start to see the picture, UKIP moving in to second place. So that, as Nick was saying, starting to become quite an important factor in English politics at least.
Emily, thank you very much for setting the scene for us. Lots of you, I know, will be joining us for the first time. You won't have been able to follow the coverage earlier today, so we'll recap on lots of the developments for you. Emily there with some of the hard facts, if you like. I'm going to go to John Hess in Nottinghamshire, because John can talk to us about Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, the two Labour gains. And John, again, for those viewers who are really just joining us in the early evening like this, just underline for us what's gone on in your region there.
Well, Hugh, this is significant. This is the River Trent. On that side of the Trent is Nottingham City Council, very much a Labour fortress. Until about an hour ago, this side of the embankment in Nottinghamshire, the county of Nottinghamshire, well, this was a Conservative-controlled authority. Conservatives have controlled the authority for the last 4 years, and it looked touch and go at some stage as to whether Labour would be able to get that overall majority. The thing is, and this is significant, the last handful of wards that were declared in parliamentary terms, and this is where the government will be concerned, I suspect, is that they fall into the Nottingham suburbs in those swing seats like Broxtowe, which at the moment is held by the Health Minister Anna Soubry, constituencies like Sherwood, the outskirts of this city where there was a straight fight between Tory and Labour, where UKIP, although they polled well, weren't really a factor, and Labour have put an awful lot of effort into those wards, and this evening it looks as though it's turned up the goods. So Labour, which at one stage it looked as though they would be the largest party but wouldn't have overall control, tonight are celebrating because they've just made it. They've got that kind of majority that they wanted. The Conservatives, they're disappointed, but, and this is a key thing, they believe they might be able to cut some deals with the Liberal Democrats, who didn't do nearly as badly in Nottinghamshire as was feared. And with a handful of independents, there'll be some tough spending decisions, Hugh, to be made in Nottinghamshire over the next few months or so. And the Conservative opposition, which it is now, believe that Labour won't be able to have it their own way. But certainly tonight, Labour are celebrating, as they're celebrating in neighbouring Darbishire. The Labour leader, Ed Miliband, is on his way to Ilkeston, which is in Derbyshire, but is very close to Nottinghamshire, to thank party workers and to join in the celebrations.
Just a quick sentence, John, if I can, on when you compare the Labour performance in Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, what are the pointers there?
I think the key thing is that a lot of the suburban Labour vote that disappeared has started to come back to Labour. There's also evidence that even in the old coalfield areas, some of that support has come back to Labour. Not completely. The independents in places like Mansfield have been able to send back their candidates and their councillors, but there is evidence that across Nottinghamshire, especially in North Nottinghamshire, the old coalfield area where the Labour vote disappeared, that vote has come back to Labour.
John, many thanks for now. John Hess for us there in Nottinghamshire. And while we're on the theme of things that Labour are happy about, we'll come on to some of the things they're maybe less happy about. We should, of course, mention the by-election, the parliamentary by-election in South Shields, which took place yesterday. They counted overnight. Labour held on with a reduced majority, but maintaining their share of the vote. The big difference there in the result from 2010, of course, was the big surge in UKIP. Let's talk to Richard Moss, who's our political editor from BBC North East. Richard, again, for the benefit of those viewers who may not have been with us during the day, just underline for us how this panned out, this by-election.
Yes, well, in a way, this was both a predictable result and a surprising one in some ways. Predictable in terms of a Labour victory. This is a seat the party's held after all since 1935. It's a real heartland. David Miliband left here his successor with a majority of 11,000. Now, that majority did come down to 6,000. I think Labour was satisfied with that, if not ecstatic. But as you said, the big change was the surge in votes for the UK Independence Party. Didn't stand a candidate here in the 2010 general election, but scored 24% last night and came a clear second. And they seem to benefit really from the collapse in support for the coalition parties. The Conservatives slipped to third, their vote more than halved from the 2010 general election, but the biggest collapse was in the Liberal Democrat vote. Out of 9 candidates, they came 7th. They polled 1.4%, which I think is the lowest share they've ever polled in a by-election, and they lost their deposit. In fact, the only 2 candidates that finished below them were the monster raving Looney Party and a rather eccentric candidate who believes he's the true king of the British peoples.
OK, Richard, thank you very much. Richard Moss there with his take on the South Shields by-election. And Chris Grayling, when we listen to that, I mean, I suppose that you've got to confront again at the end of the day, we've been at it now for hours, but basically discussing different aspects of the way you respond as a government, certainly as a Conservative party, to the threat that UKIP clearly poses to you in some really sensitive areas. So what is the nature of your response this evening?
Well, look, of course, if you lose seats in a mid-term set of local elections, it is a wake-up call. The party has to take a step back and think, what else do we need to do to reach out to people whose support we will need come the general election? At the same time, I think it would be a huge mistake for us to be blown off track with the strategies we're pursuing on dealing with the deficit, on tackling the problems in welfare, on tackling the problems in education, because these are changes that the country really needs. And yes, we are taking some difficult decisions, but if we allow ourselves, by one set of disappointing results, to be blown off course, that will say, I think, as a government, that we are not clear in the direction we're following and not trying to do the right thing for the country. So we must be responsive and thoughtful to this, but we must also be careful not to overreact to it.
OK, that's the balance, isn't it, which lots of viewers maybe will find difficult to understand. You're not going to be blown off course, and yet you need to do things to show that you're responding to what's happened. So where do those changes happen?
Well, there are some things. I mean, if you look at what UKIP is arguing, and indeed if you look at some of the things our own supporters are arguing, we want to sort out the problems with the Human Rights Act. We want to address the issue of our relationship with the European Union. Right now, we have 303 seats in the House of Commons. The other parties significantly outnumber us. Now, right or wrongly, they're entitled to their views, but Labour and the Lib Dems don't want to address those issues in this Parliament. So we cannot do some of the things that our natural supporters want us to do. We've got to be open about that. We've got to have clear plans for the next manifesto. We've got to demonstrate that we are really committed to those changes. But we also have to be very clear in saying there are some limitations in coalition to what we're going to be able to deliver.
The Queen's speech, is that likely to deliver, without you giving us a list of things which you can't do, is that likely to have elements within it which will be seen as a response partly to what we've seen overnight?
Well, there isn't going to be a great change to the Queen's speech off the back of these local elections. I mean, the Queen's speech is, at this stage, is always being written on vellum somewhere in the wilds of craftsman England. So, there isn't going to be some great reaction over the weekend where the Queen's speech is torn up and rewritten. What there should be in the Queen's speech, and there will be in the Queen's speech, is a sensible balance of proposals across the spectrum which deliver some of the solutions to the problems that Britain faces.
Nick? The centre of that, I am told, will be measures on immigration, and in a sense what you've seen is a preemptive response to this result from the government. Chris Grayling himself, as Justice Secretary, had, and I'm sure he'll say that he believed this anyway, but tougher prison regime came in the last week. We have from the Prime Minister the promise of tougher measures on immigration. We have from the Prime Minister a promise of an EU referendum if the Conservatives are in power on their own. So in a sense we've had a lot of these promises now. The intriguing thing I think that Chris Grayling is suggesting, though, and it'd be interesting to know if he is that in a sense we'll have to have a twin-track approach from the Conservative Party. Here's what they would do in government. Here they are advertising what they'd like to do if only they weren't in government with that lot over there, the Liberal Democrats. And they won't wait till the manifesto to do that. They'll tell us over the next 2 years, we'd really love to give you a referendum. Sorry, we can't. We'd really love to rip up the Human Rights Act. Sorry, we can't.
Ed, fair point?
Well, of course we are stopping the Conservatives doing what they'd ideally like. That's what happens in a coalition. It's a compromise of different policies. We've got some of ours over. For example, the £10,000 tax-free allowance. And one of the things we've found in this election, people are beginning to realise that that is benefiting them, a £700 income tax cut, but not enough people are hearing that message. So part of the message for the Liberal Democrats is to get our successors in the coalition government over to people. We're in government for the first time for many years, and we're delivering on Liberal Democrat policies, making a fairer society. We've also actually got to expose some of the UKIP policies a little bit more. They are talking about, look at what they're saying. They're talking about massive cuts of tax for the richest people in the land. Liberal Democrats are against that.
That's not what you're doing.
No, you are the ones who had left off the richest. Under Liberal Democrats and Conservative coalition, the richest in the land will pay more in tax in every year of the coalition than they did in any year of Labour. Labour had a very bad record on taxing the rich, and the UKIP want to reduce the tax on the rich, which is exactly the opposite of Liberal Democrats wanting to take the poorest out of tax. So we need to get our message over, but we also need to expose UKIP for some of its slightly weird policies.
Let's stop it for a second, because we'll be joined by Nigel Farage for the second time today. In just a moment, he'll come in a couple of minutes' time and we can put some of these points to him. On the Green, we have John Barron, who's the Conservative MP for Basildon and Billericay. And on the precise European, the EU context, Mr Barron, what are you now hoping for in the light of what's happened?
Well, I hope the government and the party leadership will listen and learn from two key errors. The first is that we must take UKIP seriously. It's not simply a protest party, and I'm afraid Europe does feature in that. We need to address that issue. But secondly, I think the party leadership needs to accept that there is deep public mistrust when they hear politicians, the public hear politicians making promises about European issues. Too many have been broken in the past, and that is why 100 Conservative backbenchers have come together, and we're trying to urge the government to bring forward the legislation into this Parliament for the referendum and the next. That would show serious intent, and I think it would address some of the key concerns where, certainly in Essex, and I'm sure nationally, a lot of natural Conservative supporters are voting UKIP at the moment because of the issue of Europe.
Let's get a response, Mr Barron, from Chris Grayling on that. Is he likely to be satisfied by the events of the months ahead or not?
Well, I mean, David Cameron has already talked about the need to really ensure that our supporters and those who might support us, those who support need to win back, have the comfort of knowing that a Conservative government would deliver in Europe. And I think John and I both know that the party is sufficiently united on this issue that it is inconceivable that we could back away from this promise.
Oh, well, so what do you make of that, Mr Barron?
Well, I think that's only half the argument. I mean, we've always said, when we raised this issue back a year ago, that the commitment has to be both credible and believable. Well, it's credible because we have an out option as part of the referendum in the next Parliament, but it's not yet believable. What would make it more believable is if there was support for legislation in this Parliament rather than simply an election manifesto promise, because too many of those have been broken in the past. Make it an attempt, a serious attempt in this Parliament to pass the legislation enabling the referendum in the next Parliament, and I think it would address a lot of people's concerns that you simply can't trust the politicians. They've said all this before and nothing's come of it. Well, legislation in this Parliament would fundamentally address that point, and I think, and many think likewise on the Conservative backbenchers, take a central plank of support away from UKIP. Why bother UKIP, voting UKIP, when you've got a mainstream party offering you an in-out referendum and are really serious about that offer?
Nick?
Mr Barron, are you saying that the Prime Minister should pick a fight that you know and he would know he's bound to lose because you haven't got the votes to get a referendum in the House of Commons, and he should try to get a government piece of legislation despite the fact that his coalition partners in the Liberal Democrats will say, well, no thanks very much, we're not doing it?
Well, 2 points there. First of all, I don't think it's quite obvious that he would lose, because I know of Labour backbenchers and indeed one or two Liberals who would support the legislation, who've argued for a very long time that actually we need an in-out referendum on Europe because the EU has fundamentally changed since we first joined it and was last consulted the people on it in the mid-70s. And you well know, Nick, it doesn't have to be a government piece of legislation. I would like that to be the case, but if the Prime Minister can't go that far, he could certainly support a private member's bill if we can bring it forward into the House and make it clear to everyone that it has Conservative backing. That would be an interesting situation, and I actually think he could succeed. But even if he failed, I'd put this to you, at least the people would understand that he was serious in his intent. Win or lose, I think there's no downside from actually pushing for it from the government's point of view.
Would that not just highlight the Prime Minister's weakness? So the phrase in office but not in power comes to mind. If you say, we're going to try and pass legislation, but don't blame me if it won't go through, I'm only the Prime Minister.
Well, not if he's genuine in his attempt to get it through. I mean, if it's just a ploy to try to just, knock this into the long grass, I completely agree with you. But if he's actually serious in his attempt to get this through, I don't think, as long as you are sort of bold heart and you know, you really do try and push these things through, I don't think it matters if you fail, as long as you've done it you've failed for the right reasons. In other words, you've given it your best, and people will understand that. The idea that you don't put a piece of legislation into Parliament because you're worried about losing, I think, you know, is a nonsense, frankly. Let him try, really push it hard. People would know then he is serious, and I don't see there being any political downside to losing. But I think it would be a far closer call than you think, Nick. I know Labour and Liberal MPs who would support this.
Have you sat down and discussed it with David Cameron?
We have last year, but we were focusing on getting the referendum, because when we first put our letter in and garnished that 100 backbench MP support, we were focusing on the referendum in the next Parliament.
Not the ideal situation, is it, that senior Tory backbenchers have to come on the television to negotiate with the Prime Minister about how to deal with an election setback, is it?
Well, we've requested a meeting. The last letter that we put in was put in on the 2nd of April. A meeting, he seemed to suggest that a meeting was okay, but we've been having trouble getting out of number 10. The details of that meeting. All I'm saying to you is what I've said to him briefly in the division lobbies, but was hoping to put it more in a constructive meeting with him. But I think he's got the message already, Nick. These election results clearly show that he's got to start taking UKIP seriously, and the best way to convince people that he's serious about this issue is actually to support legislation in this Parliament for that referendum in the next. If he did that, it begs the question, why bother voting UKIP?
Mr Barron, thanks for joining us. Chris Grayling listening very carefully there. And clearly the implication, not the implication, he basically said it, didn't he? Prime Minister's not taken them seriously. That's been the whole problem. That's the reason you're confronted with these gains today. He's not taken them seriously.
No, I don't think that's right. I mean, John, I have great respect for John's views. The last month, the Prime Minister spent an awful lot of time on the campaign trail. There will have to be a lot of thinking clearly now. We've got a 2-year run to the general election. We've got a 1-year run to the European elections. The Prime Minister himself has said these are things we need to consider carefully. And that consideration will duly happen. The one thing I'm absolutely clear about, we cannot go into the next election with the electorate having any doubt whatsoever about our commitment to deliver a renegotiation of our membership and an in-out referendum for the UK population to say, are we happy with the deal that can be done, or do we want to leave?
Very quick comment from both of you. I'll start with Ed, because basically, as Nick was making the point there, you know, any plan to bring legislation forward on this basis is something that you're simply not going to play with.
Wasn't the coalition agreement, and Nick Clegg's made it clear that he's won't countenance this. So I don't think it's a runner.
Chucker, what would you do if it happened?
Listening to Chris and John talking about this,
what would your attitude be if you brought forward legislation on that?
Well, as we've said, we don't think that is the right thing to do. It
You
will
voted
cause
it down.
huge uncertainty for business. There's nothing that will deter foreign direct investment into this country more. And honestly, listening to Chris and John, I'm simply reminded of the John Major government and the Maastricht rebels. I'm not denying that the EU is an important issue for people, but honestly, if the Conservative Party seeks to enter into a bidding war as to who can be have the most right-wing policies on the EU or immigration, they will lose. And it's very interesting. I'm sitting here flanked by 2 cabinet ministers, and not once have we heard the 2 words growth and jobs. That is people's #1 priority. I was at my Job Centre Plus office this morning. I've got 4,100 people claiming job seekers allowance. I have seen long-term unemployment go up by 20%. People's #1 concern right now is they want more jobs, they want better pay, and they want the cost of living crisis addressed, when they have seen a situation where under this government we have seen pay packets drop by £1,700 on average, and they haven't said anything about it. We've just spent the last 5 minutes talking about the EU. That's what we've just
turning it round. I talked about reducing the tax burden on the lowest paid, which Labour failed to do, because that's one of the best ways of encouraging employment, encouraging growth. There are many other things we're doing. Chris actually talked about. Chris talked about reducing the deficit. So Chucker, you were absolutely wrong on that. So we are focusing on this, and what we're seeing is more private sector jobs created, 1 million more. That is actually a good record. It's one of the reasons. You talk to the economists, Chucker. So what you'll find, economists are saying they're surprised. Rather than just interrupting all the time, let's listen to the facts, because the facts are from independent economists. They're surprised that we're managing to create so many jobs despite the growth difficulties, and we're doing that because we're focusing on helping the unemployed. That is the right thing to do. Unemployed young people, low-paid people. We're trying to help them. Labour failed to do so.
Stop for a second, because we've got another result in. I was telling you about Doncaster. where the mayoral contest was taking place, and that result is now in. I think they were counting for, 8 hours at least. But there you have it. It is a Labour gain. And Peter Davis, who is standing as an independent, this time not as an English Democrat, has just been pipped at the post, really. And if you look at the share of the vote, you'll see that 51%, 49%. And then that was in the second round, of course, because there were other candidates there too. It's that supplementary vote system. So they went into the second round. That's why it took so long. OK, what we're going to do now is think about the landscape at the end of today. And Jeremy Vine is going to tread through the landscape for us.
Yeah, it's quite a good way to just visualise the map, isn't it, Hugh, and see exactly how it's changed. So we start here with the way it looked at the start of this extraordinary 24 hours. I just reminded here how much blue there is, Conservative blue. These were very much elections held on the Conservatives' home territory. Patch of red up there, but bits of grey, not too much. Grey, of course, meaning no overall control, mainly blue. So these are areas where the Conservatives were strong. Now, well, they've been dislodged in lots of places. Cumbria goes to no overall control, Lancashire no overall control. You heard earlier from Nottinghamshire, it goes into Labour red, Darbishire Labour red, Warwickshire no overall control, heading south, Gloucestershire no overall control, East Sussex no overall control. So there's lots of places where the blue has been swept away by grey. And the question now is what the parties make of these results with the extraordinary intervention of UKIP and a vote for UKIP, the like of which no one really expected. Let's go back to these numbers here and let's look at what we call projected national share. Bring it on here and just remind ourselves what the parties have done. So these are the shares of the votes that we think the parties would have had this election been held, not just in these mainly Conservative areas, but across the whole country. We have Labour first on 29%. Big proviso with this figure is that it is actually lower than Labour scored in any local election in all their years of opposition between 1979 and 1997. Although that said, last time these seats were fought, they were on 20. So it's an improvement on that for sure. Then we come to the Conservatives, 25%. Now, we have been doing these projected national shares, BBC has, for a long time, since the early 80s. We've never seen the Conservatives down that low in local elections on projected national share. It's a very low result for them. This is the extraordinary one, of course, that's driven all the debate in the studio and driven all the analysis, is that UKIP have suddenly not only got this 23%, they're now in our histogram here. They're now appearing as a bar on our graph for the first time. We've got 4 main parties here for the purposes of this election, and they're on 23%. Quite extraordinary. And then the Lib Dems have never scored as low as 14%, and there they are, down in 4th place. The others, by the way, on 9%. So now we look at a bit of context here, and we look back at how parties, the main parties, the 3 main parties, if I can still call them that, have done in previous elections. Let's look back at this projected national share going back to 2005. Bear in mind, the seats that we're talking about here were last fought in 2009. The time before that was 2005, the same day as the general election. So as you'd expect, Labour were ahead only just in the equivalent parallel local election. So Labour 33, Conservatives 31, and they won, of course, Labour a general election on that day. Their fortunes then were reversed, and they come down to 20% here, and that's the absolute dark days of Gordon Brown, with the Lib Dems on 26, and a pretty good result for the Conservatives, 35%, who are beginning to get the scent of power, as indeed they then managed to get that power. 2010 election, not an outright majority for them, but they're in number 10 along with the Liberal Democrats. Because then all the complications start and the problems of coalition government mount, and you can see the Lib Dems seem to be taking the biggest hit here. 16% last year, 31% for the Conservatives in the local elections, and 38%. So there we leave. That's a trajectory that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? The coalition government comes in, Labour rebound under Ed Miliband, and both the Conservatives and more so the Lib Dems start to lose. And then we have this result. And here it is. So Labour then come down to 29. The Conservatives come down to 25. And the Lib Dems come down to 14. And we're seeing the 3 main parties, if I can call them that, seems like a bit of an unfairness to UKIP to call them that today, but they're all under 30%. This is how extraordinary this election has been. So we're still, you're going to be digesting exactly who's lost their votes to UKIP. We assume usually it's the Conservatives, but it might be a much more complicated picture than that. And it's given us an amazing election result here in mid-term.
Certainly has, Jeremy. Thank you very much, Jeremy Vine there. So let me just really reinforce those figures from that projected national share. John Curtis, our resident number cruncher, analyst, expert, sending me a few pointers about this, saying, as Jeremy was saying, first time that the three Westminster main parties have all been below 30% on this one. Oh, by the way, Angle C is now through as a hung council. Despite those Plaid Cymru gains, it's still there as no overall control, and that count has been going on for most of the day. Back to the PNS, the equal lowest ever figure for the Conservatives, the lowest ever figure for the Lib Dems, and Labour's performance, says John Curtis, much worse than in the last 2 years, though better than at the end of Gordon Brown's government in 2010. And just the figures once again for you of this projected national share. A very quick sentence on what that is. It's a projection. It's not a forecast or a prediction, OK? It's a projection of what might have been the picture had these elections been taking place everywhere, which they haven't been, obviously. It's been much more restricted. So Conservatives 25, Labour 29, UKIP 23, Lib Dems on 14. Nigel Farage has joined us in the studio. Looking quite bright, actually, and breezy, Nigel, given that you were here, what was it, 8-9 hours ago?
Yes, well, it's been a long day, but a very interesting day. A good day for us, obviously, but I think, you know, a fascinating day, really, for British politics. Something has changed here. And I know that, you know, everybody would like to say that it's just a little short-term stamp-your-feet protest. It isn't. There's something really fundamental has happened here, and people have had enough of three parties. They're called mainstream, I'm not so sure why, but three parties who increasingly resemble each other. The differences between them are very, very narrow, and they don't even speak the same language that ordinary folk out there who are struggling for housing and jobs speak. So I think this is really very interesting, and it gives us a position on which we can build. For UKIP, the first past the post system is a nightmare because we draw Tory votes, Lib Dem votes and Labour votes. We're spread across the country. But what you've seen today for the first time in places like Yarmouth, Thanet, up in Boston, is UKIP actually winning majorities in some of these towns, and possibly following on from the model of the Lib Dems in the 80s and 90s, we will now target our resources on these areas. So I think today is a game changer.
Nigel, are you looking for a form of constitutional reform, given what you have just said in terms of how your votes are evenly spread? Where are you on the whole voting reform issue? Do you want to see a more proportional voting system?
I was astonished with the Lib Dems having campaigned for 40, 50 years for proportional representation that Clegg sold out to the Conservatives to have a referendum on AV, which wasn't even proportional. It was preferential.
What do you want?
You know, I think we can learn from the Germans. Now, whoever thought the Germans would teach us about democracy? But they've got the AV plus system. It means you've got two votes. It means you keep the benefits of our system, the member representing the town or the suburban area, but you also get a second ballot paper where you can express an opinion. And we're using it in a sense already in the Scottish Parliament, we're using it in the Welsh Assembly, we're using it in London, and that is what I would like to see. And then any significant minority view would get a say in Westminster, and our democracy will be healthier, and our turnouts, I think, will go up.
What do you do with power if you get it?
Well, I think that's a long way off for UKIP, so that's a rather premature question. You know, I think what we've done overnight and today is we've taken our first substantial step towards being a party that credibly can win seats at Westminster. So I think, you know, power is some way off. But I would argue that when it comes to power, we haven't got much power. We've actually transferred most of our power across the English Channel to the institutions of the European Union, and the British government are really like lapdogs most of the time, impotent actually on so many different issues. So to me, the ultimate debate on power is where is it? Is it here in London or somewhere else?
Chris Grayling, where is it?
Well, my question to Nigel, and you know he's clearly made good gains today, but if come the general election, UKIP supporters cost Conservative Party seats in parts of the country where we have currently got representation, and if UKIP don't take those seats, as we are the only party committed to an in-out referendum, in a sense, the danger is for UKIP that they end up helping Labour into power and actually ending up with no referendum.
It's a very important point. There's lots of people
I mean, to be honest, you know, Miliband's going to promise a referendum before the election. Of course he is. It's become a really almost a tradition now, since '97, that at every election, all three parties promise a referendum and none deliver. But even if it was just David Cameron, if he was still your leader, that promised it, I mean, the problem I would have with it is that he did all this before. The cast iron guarantee. You know, I mean, he really staked his reputation. You won the Euro elections in '09 on the back of this cast iron guarantee. Your literature said it, and we really find find out afterwards he never actually meant it. So why should we trust him?
Well, the cast iron guarantee was about the Lisbon Treaty, which was ratified by the time we got to power.
Weasel,
so we could
weasel.
Nigel, how do you unratify a ratified treaty?
Bits of the Lisbon Treaty have been ratified and come into place since this coalition government took power.
No,
if you've got the political
simply
will,
not right.
if you've got the political will, you can do what you like. And Harold Wilson, in '75, held a retrospective referendum. OK? He did it on the Treaty of Rome, and you could have done that, but your man, actually, to gain votes, to try and win an election, basically made a promise that he never intended to keep, and that's my problem with your leader.
Do you think most of your supporters and your voters vote for you over Europe, or is your impression that they're voting for you for a number of reasons?
I think that Euroscepticism, which used to be, I mean, often Labour too, but when the Maastricht division, Euroscepticism was led by Tory MPs who thought if we tell the British public that Article 136, subsection 2, clause 3, para 2, is absolutely fundamental to the way we live in this country, we'll wake the country up and storm the barricades. And what we do, now hang on, let me finish. We don't talk about Article 136, we talk about the consequences of Europe on people's everyday lives. And in particular, what has been the game changer in many, many ways over the European debate has been open door immigration to poor Eastern European countries since 2004. There is a howl of outrage out there, particularly from unskilled young people who cannot get jobs and who are beginning to feel discriminated against in their own country. And so we fought this local election campaign saying to people, local councils provide services. I went to Boston. Do you know the average waiting time at A&E there is 9 hours because the population's exploded and the infrastructure isn't there to meet it. And I'm saying to all three of you, you know, that I really think, and this is not a prejudicial comment in any way at all, but I really think it is irresponsible, given 1 million unemployed young people, for us to open our doors to Romania and Bulgaria unconditionally on January the 1st.
What do you say to
Well, everyone's asking Nigel a question, and he's got a reputation of being a straight talker and doesn't mess around, gives the answer. How many seats are you going to win in the next general election?
I haven't got a clue.
So you don't know?
I'm not a career politician like you, and I haven't got a clue.
Is it none or is it 10?
Well, Ed, I'm a businessman who's come into this, and unlike you, I couldn't really give a damn, actually, about elections and about career and position. What I care about is getting our country back after what I think has been an act of great betrayal.
Nigel, can I just say that?
Can you answer my question?
Can I just say that's a little bit arrogant?
Should we
not
stop?
like you.
Should we stop? Should we stop? I asked you a question. Do you think it's right to open the door to Bulgaria and Romania next year? Answer that, and then I might answer yours.
We have a treaty obligation, as you know, and we don't want to break the law. Now, you would be able to do that. You'd be able to do that because you would pull Britain out of the EU and you would therefore not have those obligations. I understand that's your position. But, of course, other EU countries might react. We have more British citizens living in other EU countries than there are EU citizens living in Britain.
But not working.
And if other EU countries said, well, you're not allowing your people to come here, we're sending all your British citizens back, we'd have more people coming into the UK than would leave. So sometimes you don't tell the full story, do you, Nigel?
You
don't tell both sides of the story, do you? Is it true that you tell both sides of the story?
For every one Briton working inside the European Union, there are now 5 EU citizens working in Britain.
And it's very interesting you use the word working because a lot of the British citizens who are living in other EU countries are retired there. So if those EU countries send them back to here, they wouldn't be able to work here because they retired. So what you're suggesting is that people leave, forced out of Britain to other EU countries, the working people, and retired British people are forced back here. Now, do you tell that story when you talk about Romania and Bulgaria? It doesn't strike me that you do.
We have never...
And that's the problem. You're straight talking, but you don't tell the full truth.
History...
Tell us how many seats you're going to win.
Have we had?
But he can't say how many seats you'll win, but on the policy
in history, never have we had an uncontrolled open border to poor countries. And we do that when we've got a problem with our labour market, not just unemployment, but wages for average people being driven down.
Your solution won't help.
Never in history, you'll make it worse. Never in history have we had that. And I am suggesting to you, given where we are now, it is an irresponsible and silly thing to do.
Hang on a sec, as Nick Robinson is with us. He's with us in just a few yards away, actually, in a different studio. but Nick, it's rather crowded in here, but I'm delighted you're with us. Now, when we send...
of the day that Nigel Farage has got my seat.
Well, look, no, but absolutely. It's the temperature in the studio, which I'm sure you can feel. What does it tell us about, A, emotions today, but B, really the concerns of these three gentlemen here about what this chap has done?
Well, it tells you the frustration, doesn't it, of the three other parties. They feel that with Nigel Farage, someone who even makes them smile, let alone many people in the electorate, they feel like they're trying to grab at a bar of soap. It's awfully slippery. It kind of collides round the studio. I tried a little bit earlier with one of Mr Farage's deputies. I'll try it again, if I may, very briefly on the issue of immigration. Nigel, you keep stressing immigration as the policy. What is UKIP's view of an acceptable number of people coming into the country?
Net 50,000 a year, something like that, would be an acceptable figure. Roughly, Nick, what we had from 1950 until 1997.
But one of your spokesmen said to me earlier that, in fact, business is saying to you that that figure should be doubled, that 100,000 is a better figure.
Is that immigration or is that work permits? They are two entirely different and separate things, and one of the problems is they've all become merged.
Well, I'm asking you because when I looked on the website, I discovered that this most important policy of all for your party is, quotes, under review and being rewritten.
Well, all policies for all parties in between elections are under review, but you know, our stated policy was to aim, once the mess has been sorted out, for a net migration of a maximum of 50,000 a year and work permits on a flexible basis where they're needed, with absolutely no rights to social security benefits.
How do you count students in that number?
But no, because students, if it's done properly, are net payees to this country, and I think you have been trying to deal with that problem.
So actually, if you take out the students and you take out the work permits, you'd probably find net migration is not far different to what you're talking about.
Well, I think it probably is, because actually, if you look at it, we've had one blip good year last year, but the 10 years prior to that have been a disaster, and from next year it's going to start rising rapidly.
The 10 years prior to that,
we're joined by someone else too, who I'm sure will want to have his say. Ed Davies' Lib Dem colleagues, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Danny Alexander, who's, I think, Danny, in Inverness, that's right, isn't it?
I'm in Inverness, yeah, far away from the studio and indeed from the elections today.
Well, it's good to have you with us. Your sense of what the Lib Dems have done, because let's be honest, it's been pretty patchy for you.
Yeah, but I think we've been strong where it matters to us in the context of 2015 and the general election. If you look in the Liberal Democrat constituencies where we have members of Parliament in places like Taunton, Cheltenham, Berwick-upon-Tweed, in Westmoreland, in Cumbria, we've done very well, and we've picked up seats in other counties like Wiltshire, for example, where we have a member of Parliament. And look, in a sense, the Liberal Democrats are a party of government now, and we're part of a coalition government. And of course, parties of government get squeezed during mid-term elections. That's what's always happened, and it's happened again today. But I think that, in a sense, what's more significant is that these elections suggest that Labour can't win. They haven't made the progress that they hoped to, but the Conservatives can lose. And if you are looking at this from a Liberal Democrat perspective, both of those things are optimistic for 2015.
And what is the message for you, not just as Lib Dems, but as a coalition government, from the surge that UKIP have been able to achieve?
Well, I think for Liberal Democrats, as Ed Davey quite rightly said earlier, the lesson for us is we've got to communicate even more strongly the successes that we've had as part of the coalition of government. The income tax policies, for example, the big income tax cuts that we're delivering for 25 million working people this year. The fact that that message is getting across in seats where we have Liberal Democrat MPs shows that it's a powerful message, and we need to work harder to get it across in other parts of the country too. But look, it's inevitable, I think, that as a coalition government that has come together to take some of the most difficult economic decisions that any government's had to take for many decades, that some people, and I completely understand this, and it's completely wrong to belittle voters who've made this choice at this stage, have chosen to cast a protest vote for UKIP. I understand that, and we have to continue to explain what we're doing, why we're doing it, and why it's in the best interest of the country as we go forward to the general election in 2015.
OK, Danny Alexander in Inverness, good of you to join us. I'm going straight over to Emily because we've had another result in.
Yeah, Durham has been held by Labour. No big surprise here. It's Labour heartland. They won it last time round, even in that disaster year of 2009, near South Shields, where they've kept their share and indeed their candidate. But let's have a look at the change overnight. Labour up 24. They'll be pleased with those gains. Solid, good strand of Labour there. The Independent losing. The Lib Dems have really taken a hit there, more than double what their partners in government, the Conservatives, have taken. So that's the result in Durham. Let me just take you then, because we've only got one more to go. This is almost the final tally, just waiting for Northamptonshire. This is how the councillors' tally is looking. The Conservatives have lost 327 tonight. Labour have made gains of 284. The Lib Dems during the day went out to the evening down 122. UKIP have made those astonishing gains of 144. They've got 144 seats, 136 gains. Good day for the Green Party. They've added 5 to their tally. What does that do in terms of the council makeup? The Conservatives on 18. Don't forget, the vast majority of these are in comfortable Tory shires, but they have lost 10. 2 of those we saw to Labour, Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, and 8 have gone into no overall control. I'm not going to go through all of these, but the astonishing ones really we've put towards the top. Norfolk in no overall control, Lincolnshire in no overall control, both areas where the UKIP vote really started playing into that Conservative vote and deprived them of control of the council. Hugh.
Emily, once again, thanks very much. Emily Maitlis there for us. What are they going to be saying on the front pages and on the inside pages tomorrow? Because the comment is, of course, important. And we've got Ian Martin of The Telegraph, Kevin Maguire of The Mirror on the green for us. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Ian, your thoughts?
It's an extraordinary political event, really. I mean, you look at those numbers that you ran through earlier. If that turns out to be the case, what you're projecting, all the main parties below 30%, that's a potentially incredibly significant political moment. It suggests that the long, slow fragmentation of the British political system has gone up a gear in terms of speed, and that something very significant has happened.
Kevin, your thoughts on the significance of it?
Yeah, the ground is shaken. It's how big is the tremor? Is it an earthquake, or will it die down later? And it's trying to work out the impact on the other parties, because I would have thought Nick Clegg's terrified. David Cameron must be very worried, and, well, Ed Miliband, you'll have some concerns, although he can be quietly pleased in one way that if UKIP continue this surge, it will split the right-wing vote, and he could enter Downing Street by the back door in a couple of years' time. He doesn't really have to increase Labour's vote, but that right-wing vote, if UKIP serves as the SDP did to Labour in the 1980s, it can split that vote, and the real person who will be damaged is David Cameron. But it's a big moment. No longer will we call UKIP other. When we list the parties, it'll always be there now with its own name when we count the seats.
OK, Ian and Kevin, I'm sorry we're just running out of time, but it's good to talk to you both. And I think that, Emily, are we in a position to say that, do we have them all in or not? I'm wondering whether Northamptonshire has come, or am I being wrong on that?
We don't have the count for Northamptonshire.
Okay.
They're still finishing up there. Let me just show you what we do know, which is that essentially, can't update it for you now, but it has been held by the Conservatives. So pretty safe to say it's been held by the Conservatives. Let me just see. I've just heard in that last second. I think we can show you now.
That's it.
Ta-da! OK, majority of 15, Conservatives on 36. You can see the pattern. If I just go to show you what happened there. Good gains for Labour. Bad night for the Conservatives. UKIP then on 3, the Lib Dems taking 1 hit, but essentially the Conservatives have held on there.
OK, that's them all in. Emily, thank you very much. We've just got a couple of minutes, OK, so I'm really just wanting to get a sense in a sentence, and I really do mean a sentence, Ed, starting with you, as to, where you see things now this evening, given that we've now been able to take in the final figures there.
Well, from our perspective, we've seen some good councillors lose their seats, and that's always something to feel sorry for, because some of them have worked really hard in their communities. But we've made some gains in other areas. It's not as bad a night as it was this time last year. And in the seats that really matter for the next general election, we're actually polling well, actually above what we've done previously. So actually this isn't a bad platform for 2015 for the Liberal Democrats.
OK, what about Labour?
Look, we approach these elections with humility. We did terribly badly in 2010, and I'm pleased that we're seeing progress. We got our 2 big targets, Darbishire and Nottinghamshire, and we got 284 gains, which we're very pleased with. Does that mean that everything is sorted? No, but we have made progress in the important key marginal areas and in the south that we need to win back support in to get a majority. But the key thing is we have to demonstrate we've got the right answers on growth and jobs. That is your viewer's absolute priority. That's what we've been fundamentally focused on, which is why I think we've made progress today.
You feeling bruised as Conservatives?
Every party in power mid-term goes through difficult times when it comes to local elections. I think we've not got to be blown off track in doing what we think is right for the country. There, Nigel and I very clearly agree. Actually, we're in it to do what we think is right, and we're going to carry on doing that. But I also think Kevin Maguire's comments were very revealing. The reality is, I think Labour are unfit to take over governing the country again. It is only 2.5 years since they last were in power, and we know what happened then. I would hate to think that all the people who are lining up behind UKIP today would do so in 2 years' time and end up with Ed Miliband in power and no European referendum.
OK. Mr Farage, it's only fair, given what's happened, to give you a final word.
I think we've taken British politics, we've thrown it up into the air, we've taken votes from across the board, and the result of this, none of us can yet foresee. I would just say this, that if the government or the opposition do not respond to our major concerns on open-door immigration in Europe, then in 2015, who knows what might happen. But one thing for certain, nothing will ever quite be the same again.
OK. Mr Farage, thank you very much. Emily, I've got just a few seconds for you to show us the scores at the end of the day.
You can see here the Conservatives taking a hit on 335 losses, Labour on 291, Lib Dems losing 123, UKIP there on 147, a surge of 139 new seats, the Green Party on +5, and you can see the council makeup now. We've got them all in. The Conservatives have held 18, lost 10, Labour have gained those 2 I mentioned earlier, the Lib Dems have not picked up the 2 that they lost to the Conservatives last time round, and 8, that is the story of the night, when we unpick it, have gone into no overall control.
OK, Emily, thanks very much indeed. Thanks to Emily Maitlis and to Jeremy Vine as well, who was with us for so much of the day with his analysis. That is it. It's been a long night and a long day from all of the team at Vote 2013. Of course, we hope you've enjoyed our coverage of the elections. My thanks to everyone here. We've got Mr Grayling and Mr Ramuna and Mr Davey and to Mr Farage. And especially, of course, to Emily, who's been stalwart throughout the day with constantly updating the results. Emily, thank you very much. And to Jeremy Vine and the team as well for their splendid work. So, BBC News at 6 with Michelle Hussain is just going to be getting underway in a few seconds over on BBC One and on the BBC News channel. And, of course, don't forget there'll be another update for you on BBC News at 10 later on this evening. Until then, from all of us here, the BBC team at Westminster and around the UK and these election results, thanks for watching and goodbye.